Hello everyone and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I was 23 in the summer of 2014, and like most guys my age, I thought I was invincible. Me and 4 of my buddies from college decided to go camping near Saratoga, Texas, right in the heart of the Big Thicket. We'd heard about this old road called Ghost Road, some people call it Bragg Road, and figured it would be perfect for a night of camping and telling scary stories around a fire. The plan was simple: 2 cars, camping gear, plenty of beer, and enough snacks to last us through the night. We drove out there on a Friday evening in July when the heat was still sticky and oppressive even after sunset. Ghost Road is this old railway bed that cuts straight through some of the thickest forest in East Texas. The trees on both sides create this tunnel effect, and during the day, it's actually pretty beautiful. At night, though, it's a different story entirely. We set up our camp chairs right in the middle of the road. I know that sounds stupid now, but at the time, it felt like we owned the place. The nearest house had to be miles away, and we hadn't seen another car for the last hour of driving. We had our lanterns set up in a circle, coolers full of ice, and that feeling you get when you're young and everything seems like an adventure. For the first few hours, everything was exactly what you'd expect. We drank beer, told jokes, and tried to one-up each other with stories we'd heard about the area. The Big Thicket has a reputation for weird stuff: ghost lights, strange animals, people going missing. We were having fun with it, making fun of the local legends and acting tough. It was probably around 1 in the morning when things started getting weird. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it had gotten. Earlier in the evening, you could hear all the normal night sounds: crickets, frogs, the occasional owl. But suddenly, it was like someone had turned off a radio. The silence was so complete, it almost hurt your ears. That's when we heard the first howl. It came from deep in the trees on the left side of the road, maybe 50 yards out. At first, we all looked at each other and laughed. "Coyotes," someone said, and we went back to our conversation. But then it came again, and this time it was different. The sound was deeper than any coyote I'd ever heard, more intentional, I guess, like it had purpose behind it. Then we heard an answer from the other side of the road. I'm not talking about random animal calls here. This was like a conversation. The howls would come from the left, then the right, then back to the left. They were spaced out, deliberate, like whatever was making them was taking time to think between calls. The hair on the back of my neck started standing up, but I didn't want to be the first one to say anything. My friend Jake was the first to speak up. "You guys hearing this?" he asked, setting down his beer. We all nodded. The howling continued for maybe 10 more minutes, getting closer each time. Then it changed. Instead of howls, we started hearing these low, whooping sounds. They echoed through the trees in a way that made it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. But the worst part was that they seemed to be moving around us. The whoops would come from ahead of us down the road, then from behind, then from both sides. It was like we were being surrounded. That's when my buddy Marcus stood up and said we should probably think about leaving. I remember being relieved that someone else said it first, because I was thinking the same thing. But before anyone could move, we heard something that made us all freeze. Footsteps, not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffling of a raccoon. These were heavy, deliberate steps breaking through the underbrush, and they were slow, like whatever was making them was in no hurry at all. The steps would come in sets of 2, then pause, then 2 more steps, then another pause, like something walking upright, taking its time. We all stood up at the same time, grabbing our lanterns and looking toward the sound. The footsteps were coming from the right side of the road, maybe 30 or 40 feet into the trees. We could hear branches snapping, leaves crunching, but we couldn't see anything beyond the first line of trees. "Hello?" my friend Danny called out. I wanted to smack him. Who calls out to something making sounds like that in the middle of nowhere? But Danny was always the jokester in our group. If that's you, Patterson, you're not funny. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sounds had been. We stood there for what felt like forever, lanterns pointed toward the trees, waiting for something to happen. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then Jake whispered, "We need to go. Now." Before anyone could respond, something flew out of the darkness and hit the road behind us with a loud crack. A rock, maybe the size of a baseball, had been thrown from the trees on the left side of the road. It hit the pavement and bounced twice before rolling to a stop about 10 feet away from us. We all spun around, shining our lights toward where the rock had come from, but there was nothing there. Just trees and darkness. Then another rock came flying out, this one bigger, and it hit the hood of Marcus's car with a metallic bang that echoed through the forest. That's when I saw it. I was sweeping my lantern back and forth across the tree line when the beam caught something that shouldn't have been there. Between two large pine trees, maybe 40 feet away, something was standing perfectly still. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was tall, really tall, and covered in dark, matted hair that hung in clumps from its body. The chest was massive, broader than any man I'd ever seen, and its arms hung down almost to its knees, but it was the way it was standing that got to me the most. Its head was positioned low between its shoulders, like it was looking down at us, studying us, and it wasn't moving at all, not even breathing that I could see. It was just watching us with this calm, patient stillness that was absolutely terrifying. I couldn't make a sound. I tried to say something to the others, but my throat had completely closed up. I kept my light trained on the thing, hoping maybe I was seeing shadows or tree branches arranged in a weird way. But no, it was definitely a living creature, and it was definitely looking at us. The whole sighting lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt like hours. Then, without any warning, the thing took 2 massive steps backward and disappeared into the forest. Not crashed through the trees, not ran away, just melted back into the darkness, like it had never been there at all. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves, and then even that stopped. "Did you guys see that?" I finally managed to whisper. "See what?" Danny asked, but his voice was shaking. I pointed my light back toward the spot, but there was nothing there, just trees. There was something standing right there. Something big. Jake was already heading toward his car. "I don't care what it was. We're leaving. Right now." We didn't argue. We threw our gear into the cars faster than I've ever moved in my life. Chairs, coolers, lanterns, everything got tossed in without any organization. I kept looking back toward the trees, expecting to see that thing come walking out again, but the forest stayed dark and quiet. The drive back to town was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Nobody said a word. We just drove, windows up, doors locked, trying to make sense of what had just happened. When we finally got to a gas station with bright lights and other people around, we sat in the parking lot for an hour before anyone was ready to talk about it. 3 of them claimed they hadn't seen anything, but I could tell they were lying. You don't pack up a campsite and flee in complete panic over some thrown rocks. We all knew something had been out there with us, something that shouldn't exist, but I had to know for sure. The next day, I drove back to Ghost Road by myself. In broad daylight, with the sun shining and birds singing, it looked completely different. Just a normal dirt road through the forest. I walked to the spot where we'd been sitting, then made my way over to where I'd seen the creature. The ground there was softer than the rest of the area, probably from water runoff during the rains. And there, pressed deep into the sandy soil, was a footprint. Not a boot print, not a bear paw, a human-shaped footprint, but huge. It had to be at least 16 inches long, and I could clearly see the impressions of 5 toes at the front. I put my own size 11 boot next to it for comparison, and it looked like a child's shoe next to an adult's. The print was deep too, like whatever made it had to weigh a lot more than a normal person. There were no other prints around it that I could find, just that one perfect impression in the soft ground. I took pictures with my phone, but they came out blurry and didn't really show the detail. I tried to make a plaster cast like they do on TV, but I didn't have the right materials, and it came out all crumbly. By the time I got home, I was starting to doubt myself again. Maybe it was just a weird rock formation or tree root that looked like a footprint, but I know what I saw that night. I know there was something standing between those trees, something that walked on two legs and threw rocks and watched us with an intelligence that I still can't explain. Something that belonged in that forest and didn't appreciate us being there. I've never been back to Ghost Road, and I never will. My friends and I don't talk about that night anymore, but sometimes I catch one of them staring off into space with this look in their eyes, and I know they're thinking about it too. About that thing in the trees, watching us from the darkness. The worst part is the dreams. Even now, 10 years later, I still have them sometimes. I'm back on that road, sitting in my camp chair, and I can hear those whooping calls getting closer and closer. I try to run, but my legs won't move. And there, between the trees, that dark shape is standing perfectly still, just watching and waiting. I wake up in a cold sweat every time, and for the rest of the night I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there, somewhere in the darkness, remembering the night 5 college kids stumbled into its territory. Remembering our faces, our scent, the sound of our voices, and maybe, just maybe, waiting for us to come back. Story 2. This happened back in 2004, and I still get chills thinking about it. I was 32 then, married with 2 little kids, a 3-year-old daughter and my son who was 5. We'd driven down to my family's property near Poplar Bluff, Missouri, for a fishing trip with my mom and grandmother. It was supposed to be one of those perfect family days, you know? Just catching some fish, letting the kids run around safely, maybe having a cookout later. The property had been in our family for generations. It's this swampy area with these winding water channels that connect to the bigger river system. My grandfather used to take me fishing there when I was little, and I have nothing but good memories of the place. The only thing you had to watch out for were the alligators that sometimes came up the channels from the main river, but we all knew to keep the kids away from the water's edge. We got there around 10 in the morning on a Saturday in late June. The weather was perfect, hot but not unbearable, with a nice breeze coming through the trees. My mom and grandmother set up their chairs in the shade while I got the fishing gear ready. The kids were running around excited to be somewhere new, picking up sticks and rocks like kids do. My daughter was being particularly energetic that day. She kept wandering toward the water, fascinated by the way the sunlight reflected off the surface. I must have told her 5 times to stay back from the edge, explaining about the alligators and how dangerous the water could be. She was at that age where everything was interesting and nothing seemed scary. Around noon, she got too close to one of the channels again, and I had to raise my voice to get her attention. I wasn't angry, just firm, because safety comes first with little kids. But she didn't take it well. She started crying, not just regular crying, but that heartbroken wailing that 3-year-olds do when they think the world is ending. I felt bad immediately. She was just being curious, and here I was spoiling her fun. I picked her up and tried to comfort her, but she was really upset. The crying got louder and more dramatic, echoing across the water and through the trees. My mum came over to help, trying to distract her with snacks and toys, but she was having none of it. That's when I noticed the movement. I was holding my daughter facing toward the water when something caught my eye across one of the wider channels. The vegetation there was really thick. Cypress trees, dense undergrowth, the kind of tangled mess that you can barely see 10 feet into. At first I thought it might be a deer or maybe one of the wild pigs that roam around that area. But then whatever it was moved into a small clearing and I realized it wasn't any animal I'd ever seen before. The thing was standing upright, not crouched down like a bear might do for a few seconds, but fully erect on two legs like a person would stand. It had to be 7 or 8 feet tall, with shoulders that were incredibly broad and a body that looked massively heavy. The whole thing was covered in hair, thick matted hair that was mostly dark brown, but had these patches of lighter brown and grey, especially around what I assumed was its face. I stopped breathing. I literally held my breath without realizing it, still holding my crying daughter, just staring at this impossible thing across the water. Its arms hung down by its sides, long and thick, reaching almost to where its knees would be. The posture was relaxed, casual even, like a person just standing there, resting. But the proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms were too long, the shoulders too wide, the head too small for the massive body. The strangest part was how calm it seemed. It wasn't acting agitated or threatened. It was just standing there in that little clearing, and I got the distinct impression that it was watching us. Specifically, it seemed to be looking in the direction of my daughter, who was still crying loudly. I wanted to say something to my mom and grandmother, but I couldn't make myself speak. Part of me was afraid that if I made any noise or sudden movements, the thing might react badly. Another part of me was wondering if I was seeing things, if the heat and the stress of dealing with an upset child were making me hallucinate. The creature stayed visible for what felt like forever, but was probably only about 30 seconds. It didn't move around much, just shifted its weight slightly from one foot to the other. Its head turned a little bit, following the sound of my daughter's crying, and that's when I got a better look at the face area. The hair around its face was definitely thinner than on the rest of its body, and the skin underneath looked dark. I couldn't make out specific features from that distance, but the overall shape was more human-like than ape-like, if that makes sense. The head sat directly on the shoulders without much of a neck, giving it this hulking, powerful appearance. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it stepped backward behind another tree. I could see the vegetation moving slightly as it moved through the underbrush, but the sounds it made were incredibly quiet. Just the soft crackle of dry leaves, maybe a small branch snapping here and there. For something that size, it moved with amazing stealth. I kept staring at the spot where I'd seen it, hoping it might come back into view. But after a few minutes it was clear that whatever it was had moved deeper into the forest. My daughter had finally stopped crying and was now just sniffling quietly in my arms. I didn't say anything to my family right away. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe it had been a person in some kind of costume, though that seemed ridiculous given how remote the area was. Maybe it was a bear that had been standing up for some reason, though I'd never seen a bear with that body shape or that coloring. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that I'd seen something that shouldn't exist. But I also didn't want to scare my mom and grandmother, or worse, have them think I was losing my mind. We stayed for another couple hours, and I kept glancing across the channel, looking for any sign of movement in the trees. The kids went back to playing, my mom and grandmother continued fishing, and everything seemed normal again. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from somewhere in that dense forest. It wasn't until we were packing up to leave that I noticed the smell. When I'd first seen the creature, I'd been too focused on the visual to pay attention to anything else. But now, as we gathered our gear, I became aware of this faint odor in the air. It was hard to describe, kind of like vegetation that had been sitting in stagnant water for too long, mixed with something musky and organic. There was also this undertone that reminded me of skunk spray, but not quite as sharp. The smell wasn't overpowering, just noticeable enough to make me wrinkle my nose and wonder where it was coming from. I hadn't noticed it earlier in the day, and it didn't seem to be coming from the water or the normal swamp smells you'd expect in that environment. I mentioned it to my mom as we loaded the car, asking if she smelled anything unusual. She sniffed the air, and said she thought maybe there was a dead fish somewhere nearby, but she didn't seem concerned about it. My grandmother didn't notice anything at all. The drive home was quiet. The kids fell asleep in the back seat, worn out from their day of adventure. I kept thinking about what I'd seen, playing it over and over in my mind, trying to remember every detail. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I'd witnessed something extraordinary. When we got home, I finally told my wife about it. I expected her to be skeptical, maybe even worried about my mental state, but she listened quietly and asked good questions. She wanted to know exactly what I'd seen, how long the sighting had lasted, whether I'd felt threatened at any point. I told her that despite the shock of seeing something so unexpected, I hadn't felt like we were in danger. The creature had seemed more curious than aggressive, almost gentle in the way it had observed us. If it had wanted to cause trouble, it certainly could have. The water channels weren't that wide, maybe 40 or 50 feet across at the widest point. Something that big and apparently that strong could have easily made its way to our side if it had wanted to. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the way the thing had stood there so calmly, watching my crying daughter with what seemed like genuine interest, not predatory interest, just attention. Like it was trying to understand what was happening, why this small human was making so much noise. I also kept thinking about how quietly it had moved through the forest. For something that had to weigh several 100 pounds, it had barely made a sound. That suggested a level of familiarity with the environment that could only come from spending a lot of time there. Over the next few days, I did some research online about similar sightings in Missouri. I was surprised to find out that there had been reports of Bigfoot-type creatures in that general area going back decades. Most of the accounts described something similar to what I'd seen, a large bipedal creature covered in dark hair, usually spotted near water sources. I also learned that the Poplar Bluff area is part of a much larger ecosystem of swamps, forests, and river systems that stretches across several states. If there were unknown primates living in that region, they'd have plenty of territory to roam around in without ever encountering humans. But knowing that other people had reported similar experiences didn't make me feel any less unsettled by what I'd witnessed. If anything, it made the whole thing seem more real and more unsettling. I went back to the property a few weeks later by myself this time. I wanted to see if I could find any physical evidence of what I'd seen, footprints, broken vegetation, anything that might confirm that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The area where I'd spotted the creature was on the other side of the channel, so I had to walk quite a ways around to get there. When I finally reached the clearing where it had been standing, I found the ground was too hard and covered with too many leaves to show any clear footprints. But I did notice that several small saplings in the area were broken or bent in ways that suggested something large had moved through recently. The breaks were fresh, and they were positioned at a height that would be consistent with a very tall creature pushing through the underbrush. I also found a few tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on some thorny bushes at about shoulder height for something 7 or 8 feet tall. The hair was unlike anything I'd seen before, thicker and coarser than human hair, but not quite like any animal fur I was familiar with. I collected some of the hair samples, thinking maybe I could have them analyzed somehow, but I never followed through on that idea. What was I going to do? Walk into a lab and say I thought I had Bigfoot hair? Instead, I just kept the samples in a small plastic bag in my desk drawer, where they sit to this day. Every once in a while, I take them out and look at them, remembering that afternoon by the water channels when everything I thought I knew about the world got turned upside down. I've been back to the family property several times since then, always keeping an eye on the tree line across the channels. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes I catch a whiff of that same unusual smell, and I know I'm not alone out there. My daughter is grown up now, with kids of her own, but she has no memory of that day. To her, it was just another family fishing trip. Sometimes I wonder if she would have seen the creature too if she hadn't been crying, if her attention hadn't been focused inward on her own upset feelings. I've never regretted not alerting everyone else to what I was seeing. Looking back, I think that was the right call. The creature seemed peaceful, and I didn't want to create a panic that might have ended badly for everyone involved. But I do think about it a lot, about what it was doing there, whether it was as curious about us as we would have been about it, whether it's still living somewhere in those vast swamplands of southeast Missouri. Most of all, I think about how calmly it observed my crying child, and I wonder if maybe these creatures are more aware of human behavior than we realize. Maybe they watch us from the forest more often than we know, trying to make sense of our strange human ways, just like we try to make sense of glimpses of them. That day changed how I think about wilderness areas. Now, when I'm fishing or hunting in remote places, I pay more attention to unusual sounds and smells. I look more carefully at the shadows between the trees. And sometimes, when everything gets quiet in the forest, I get this feeling that I'm being watched by something that understands far more than it lets on. Story 3. This happened back in October of 1976, and I'm telling you right now, it still gives me nightmares. I was 24 years old then, had been fishing the river near Alton, Missouri since I was a kid. My dad taught me every bend, every deep hole, every spot where the catfish liked to hide. That particular stretch of river was my favorite, quiet, remote, and always good for a decent catch. I had my trot line set up in this bend we called the Little Lot. It's this wide curve in the river where the water slows down and gets deeper on the outside edge. Perfect spot for catfish. The nearest house was at least 1.5 miles away down this old dirt road, so you never had to worry about other people bothering your lines or making noise that would spook the fish. It was a Tuesday evening. I remember that clearly because I had Wednesdays off from the mill back then. I'd gotten off work around 4, grabbed my gear, and drove out to check the lines I'd set the day before. The sun was already getting low when I parked my truck at the top of the bank. October days are shorter, and by 7 o'clock it was getting dark fast. I should mention that I'd left my rifle in the truck. Usually, I carried it with me when I was out there alone, especially after dark. You never knew what kind of animals might be around. Wild dogs, the occasional black bear, maybe even a mountain lion if you were unlucky. But I was just planning to check the lines real quick and head home, so I only grabbed my tackle box and my old case pocket knife. Walking down to the water's edge, everything seemed normal. The air was cool but not cold, with that crisp fall feeling that makes you want to stay outside longer than you should. The leaves were starting to turn, and there was this rustling sound when the breeze picked up. Normal river sounds, water moving over rocks, a few night birds starting to call, nothing unusual. My trot lines were stretched across the river at the deepest part of the bend, anchored on both sides with heavy weights. I had to wade out about knee-deep to reach the first one. The water was cold, but not unbearably so. I was wearing my old rubber boots and heavy jeans, so I stayed reasonably dry. I was crouched down over the water, working on the second line, when I heard it. At first, I thought it might be a bellows back at someone's barn, that slow, rhythmic sound of air being forced in and out. But it was coming from right there by the river, maybe 30 feet away from where I was standing. Deep, heavy breathing, like something really big was working hard at something. The sound was loud enough that I stopped what I was doing and looked up. That's when the smell hit me. I've been around a lot of bad smells in my life. I grew up on a farm, worked in a paper mill, cleaned out chicken coops and pig pens. But this was different. It was thick and wet and sour, like a combination of mud and mildew and something that had been rotting for weeks. The kind of smell that makes your throat close up and your eyes water. My first instinct was to get away from the water. Something in my gut told me I was in trouble, even though I couldn't see anything yet. The hair on the back of my neck was standing up, and I had this overwhelming feeling that I was being watched by something that could hurt me. I started backing toward the bank, moving slow and trying not to splash. The breathing sound was still there, and it seemed to be getting closer. Or maybe I was just becoming more aware of it. Either way, it was making my skin crawl. That's when the thing stepped out of the trees. I was maybe 15 feet from the bank when it appeared in this little clearing near the water's edge. The first thing that hit me was how close it was, maybe 10 feet away from me, close enough that I could have hit it with a rock if I'd wanted to. The second thing was how wet it looked. This creature was about 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders like a man, but heavier, bulkier. It was covered in dark hair that hung in wet clumps all over its body, dripping river water onto the ground. There was green slime from the river stuck to its left leg and hip, like it had just climbed out of the water somewhere upstream. But the worst part was how still it was. The thing just stood there, not moving at all, staring right at me. It didn't seem surprised to see me, didn't act startled or aggressive. It was just watching me with this calm, patient attention that was absolutely terrifying, like it had been waiting for me to notice it. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, wanted to scream, wanted to do anything but stand there like an idiot, but my legs wouldn't work. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst, and my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my tackle box. The creature's face was the worst part. It was too human-like, but not human enough, if that makes sense. Dark skin, flat nose, eyes that seemed too intelligent for an animal, but too wild for a person. Its mouth was slightly open, and I could see teeth that looked strong enough to bite through bone. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. The whole time, that heavy breathing continued, and the smell got stronger and stronger until I thought I might throw up. Then my survival instincts finally kicked in. I turned and ran toward my truck faster than I'd ever moved in my life. I didn't look back, didn't try to be quiet, just crashed through the brush and up the bank like something was chasing me. My boots were full of water and mud, making sloshing sounds with every step, and I kept slipping on the wet leaves. Behind me, I could hear movement. Not footsteps exactly, but the sound of something large pushing through the vegetation near the water. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, the kind of noise a big animal makes when it's not trying to be stealthy. I made it to my truck in record time, threw my gear in the back, and got out of there without looking back. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition, and I stalled the engine twice before I finally got it started. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my rearview mirror, expecting to see something following me down that dirt road. Every shadow looked like it might be moving. Every tree looked like it might be hiding something. By the time I got back to town, I was sweating despite the cool evening air. I didn't tell anyone about it for weeks. Who was I going to tell? My wife would have thought I'd been drinking. My buddies would have laughed at me. The sheriff would have wanted to know what I'd been smoking. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. That thing by the river, the way it had looked at me, the smell that had made my stomach turn. I kept going over every detail in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that the creature had been in the water when I first got there. That would explain why it was so wet, why it had river slime on its leg. Maybe it had been fishing too in its own way, and I'd interrupted it. That thought was almost worse than the original encounter. The idea that this thing might be a regular resident of that stretch of river, that it might have been watching me fish there for years without me knowing it. I stayed away from the river for almost a month after that. Every time I thought about going back to check my lines, I'd remember that heavy breathing and that terrible smell, and I'd find something else to do instead. When I finally did go back, I made sure to bring my rifle and go during the day. I also brought my brother-in-law with me, though I didn't tell him the real reason I wanted company. I just said I'd heard there might be wild dogs in the area. The spot where I'd seen the creature looked completely normal in daylight, just trees and water and muddy bank. But when we got close to the water's edge, my brother-in-law wrinkled up his nose and asked if I smelled something dead nearby. I did smell it. Faint, but definitely there. That same sour, swampy odor that had nearly made me sick that night in October. It wasn't as strong in the daylight, but it was unmistakable. We didn't stay long. I checked my lines quickly, found them empty, and we headed back to the truck. My brother-in-law kept looking around nervously, like he could sense something wasn't right about the place. On the drive back, he asked me if I'd ever seen anything weird out there. I told him no, but I could tell he didn't quite believe me. He'd felt something too, that uneasiness that comes when you're somewhere you don't belong. I never did go back to that bend in the river after dark. During the day, sure, but always with someone else and always with my rifle close at hand. And I never saw the creature again, though sometimes when the wind was right, I'd catch a whiff of that smell and know I wasn't alone out there. The thing that bothers me most about the whole experience is how calm the creature had been. It didn't act like a wild animal surprised by a human. It acted like it knew I'd be there, like it had been waiting for the right moment to show itself. That suggests a level of intelligence that I don't like to think about. If these things are smart enough to observe human behavior, to learn our patterns and routines, then they're a lot more dangerous than most people realize. I'm in my 70s now, and I've had a lot of time to think about what I saw that night. I've read stories online about other people who've had similar experiences, and it makes me feel both better and worse. Better because I know I wasn't losing my mind. Worse because it means there are more of these things out there than anyone wants to admit. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still living somewhere along that river, still fishing in its own way, still watching the occasional human who wanders too close to its territory. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and the house is quiet, I can still hear that deep, heavy breathing and smell that awful, swampy odor. I know it sounds crazy, but I think it recognized me that night. Not just as a human, but as me specifically. Like it had been watching me fish there for years, learning my habits, waiting for the right moment when I'd be alone and vulnerable. That's the part that still gives me chills. The thought that something that big and that strong had been studying me without my knowledge, deciding whether I was a threat or just an annoyance. I guess I'm lucky it decided I wasn't worth the trouble. Story 4. I've been hunting deer for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything the woods had to offer. Bears, wild hogs, the occasional mountain lion track. Nothing that really fazed me anymore. But what happened to me in November of 2015 near Wiggins, Mississippi changed all that. I still get goosebumps thinking about it, and I'm not the type of guy who scares easily. I was hunting alone that day in the DeSoto National Forest, about 15 miles northeast of Wiggins. It's thick country out there, pine forests mixed with hardwood bottoms, lots of creeks and swampy areas where the deer like to bed down during the day. I'd been hunting this particular area for 3 seasons and knew it pretty well. I got to my stand around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was one of those perfect November days, cool but not cold, maybe 55 degrees, with just enough breeze to keep the mosquitoes away. The leaves were still changing colors, creating this beautiful patchwork of reds and yellows through the canopy. My tree stand was positioned about 18 feet up in a big oak tree, overlooking a natural funnel where deer traveled between their bedding area and a food plot I'd planted earlier that year. I'd seen several good bucks using this trail over the past few weeks, so I was optimistic about my chances. The plan was to stay until dark, which would be around 6:30 that time of year. Deer movement is usually best in the last hour before sunset, so I settled in with my rifle and prepared to wait. Around 5:15, just as the light was starting to get that golden late afternoon quality, I spotted movement through the trees. A nice 8-point buck was picking his way slowly down the trail, stopping every few steps to test the air and look around. Perfect shot opportunity. I raised my rifle, a Remington 730-06 that I'd been hunting with for years, and waited for the deer to step into the clear shooting lane I'd established. The buck obliged, pausing broadside at about 80 yards. I squeezed the trigger and heard the solid thump that tells you you've made a good hit. The deer ran maybe 50 yards before I lost sight of him in the thick brush. I could hear him crashing through the undergrowth for a few more seconds, then silence. From the sound of the shot and the way he'd reacted, I was confident it was a killing hit. But you always want to give them time to expire before you start tracking. I stayed in the stand for 30 minutes watching and listening. Standard practice is to wait at least a half hour for a heart or lung shot, longer if you suspect a gut shot. The woods were quiet except for the normal sounds. Squirrels rustling in the leaves, a few birds calling, the distant sound of a truck on the highway. By the time I climbed down from my stand, it was getting dark fast. November daylight doesn't last long, and once the sun drops below the tree line, you've got maybe 20 minutes before you need a flashlight to see anything. I had my headlamp in my pack, but I wanted to find the deer before I needed it. Blood trailing in the dark is always harder, even with a good light. I shouldered my rifle, slung my pack, and started following the trail where I'd last seen the buck. The blood trail was easy to follow at first. Bright red droplets on the leaves, splashes on tree trunks where he'd brushed against them. Good sign. That meant lung blood, which usually indicates a quick, clean kill. I was feeling good about the shot and looking forward to field dressing a nice buck. I followed the trail for maybe 100 yards through some thick stuff. Briars, young pines, the kind of dense cover that deer love but hunters hate. The blood sign was consistent, and I could see the disturbed leaves where the deer had crashed through. Then the trail led into a more open area. Bigger trees, less undergrowth, easier walking. That's where I found him, piled up against a fallen log maybe 20 yards ahead of me. Even in the dim light, I could see the white belly fur that tells you your deer is down for good. I was feeling pretty satisfied with myself as I walked up to the buck. He was bigger than I'd thought. Probably would score in the 130s, maybe 140s. Nice symmetrical rack, good body weight. Definitely one of the better deer I'd taken. Field dressing took about 15 minutes. I'd done it so many times I could almost do it in my sleep. But I always take my time to do it right. You don't want to puncture the stomach or intestines and contaminate the meat. By the time I finished, it was full dark. Now came the hard part, getting the deer back to my truck. It was about a half-mile drag through the woods, mostly uphill. The buck probably weighed 160, 170 pounds dressed out, so it was going to be a workout. I put on my headlamp, shouldered my rifle and pack, grabbed the deer by the back legs, and started dragging. The first couple 100 yards weren't too bad. The ground was relatively flat, and the leaves were slick enough that the deer slid pretty easily. But then the terrain got rougher. Logs to drag over, ditches to cross, thick patches of briars that caught on everything. By the time I'd gone maybe 300 yards, I was breathing hard and sweating despite the cool air. That's when I had to stop and rest. I was in this little clearing, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by big pine trees. I dropped the deer's legs, slipped my pack off my shoulders, and sat down on a fallen log to catch my breath. My rifle was leaning against a tree next to me, within easy reach but not in my hands. The headlamp was still on, creating this cone of white light in front of me. Everything outside that cone was pitch black, the kind of darkness you only get deep in the woods on a moonless night. I could hear the normal night sounds starting up. Owls calling in the distance, the rustle of small animals in the leaves. I was just starting to feel rested enough to continue when I noticed the eyes. They were right at the edge of my light beam, maybe 25 or 30 feet away. Two yellowish, reflective dots, spaced wider apart than any deer or other animal I'd ever seen. And they were high off the ground, at least 7 feet, probably closer to 8. My first thought was that it might be another hunter, maybe someone with a headlamp coming to see what my light was about. But hunters don't usually have eyes that reflect light like that, and the spacing was all wrong for a human face. I reached over slowly and picked up my rifle, trying not to make any sudden movements that might spook whatever was watching me. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just kept staring at me from the darkness. That's when I decided to try something that probably wasn't very smart. I unholstered my Glock 9mm from my belt and fired one shot into the ground next to me. The muzzle flash lit up the entire clearing for a split second, and the gunshot echoed through the forest like thunder. I was hoping the noise would scare off whatever was watching me, the way it would with a bear or wild hog. Most animals will run when they hear a gunshot, especially that close. But the eyes didn't move. If anything, they seemed more focused on me after the shot. The creature, and by now I was sure it was some kind of creature, not another hunter, turned its head slightly to the left, like it was trying to get a better look at me. But it didn't retreat, didn't show any sign of fear or aggression. That's when I really started to get scared. I've been in the woods long enough to know that most animals are more afraid of humans than we are of them. When they encounter people, their first instinct is to run away. The fact that this thing was just standing there, calmly observing me after I'd fired a gun, meant it wasn't like any normal animal. I slowly got to my knees, keeping the pistol ready and my eyes fixed on those reflecting orbs. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my mouth had gone completely dry. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. The creature finally moved. Not quickly, not aggressively, just a slow turn to the left as it began walking away from the clearing. I could hear its footsteps, heavy, deliberate, the sound of something big moving through dry leaves and fallen branches. But here's the thing that really got to me. The footsteps sounded like a person walking upright, not the 4-footed gait of a bear or the irregular crashing of a deer running away. This was the steady, measured pace of something walking on 2 legs. I kept my headlamp trained on the spot where I'd seen the eyes, but the creature had moved beyond the reach of my light. I could still hear it moving through the forest, the sounds getting fainter as it got farther away. But it wasn't running. It was just walking calmly into the darkness, like our encounter had been perfectly normal. I stayed crouched in that clearing for at least 10 more minutes, listening and watching for any sign that the thing was coming back. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the pistol steady, and I kept expecting to see those eyes reappear at the edge of my light. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I grabbed my deer and started dragging it toward my truck as fast as I could manage. I didn't care about being quiet or taking my time. I just wanted to get out of those woods. The rest of the drag took maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. Every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that creature following me through the trees. When I finally reached my truck, I was so relieved I almost cried. I loaded the deer into the bed as quickly as I could, threw my gear in the cab and got the hell out of there. I didn't even take time to properly secure the deer. Just wanted to put some distance between me and whatever I'd encountered in that clearing. The drive home was surreal. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Those eyes were too high off the ground for any normal animal, and the way the creature had reacted to the gunshot wasn't natural. When I got home, I didn't tell my wife what had happened. How do you explain something like that without sounding crazy? I just said the hunt had gone well and left it at that. But I did some research online over the next few days, reading about Bigfoot sightings and encounters in Mississippi. I was surprised to find out that there had been reports of large, upright creatures in that exact area going back for years. Other hunters, fishermen, people who didn't seem like the type to make up stories. The more I read, the more convinced I became that I'd had an encounter with something that's not supposed to exist. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt in that moment when those eyes were staring at me from the darkness. I went back to that area of the forest the following weekend, during daylight this time, and with a buddy along for backup. We found the clearing where I'd stopped to rest, and we found something that made my blood run cold. Where the creature had been standing, the air still carried a faint odor, musky, wild, with an undertone of something I couldn't identify. It wasn't overpowering, but it was definitely there, and it was unlike any animal smell I'd encountered before. We also found some disturbed vegetation where it had walked away, broken branches, compressed leaves, the kind of sign a large animal would leave, but no clear footprints in the hard ground. I've been back to hunt that area several times since then, always during daylight and always with company. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes I catch a whiff of that same musky odor, and I know I'm not alone in those woods. The thing that bothers me most about the whole experience is how calm the creature seemed. It didn't act threatened or aggressive, just curious, like it was trying to figure out what I was doing there, maybe wondering if I was a danger to it or its territory. That suggests a level of intelligence that I find deeply unsettling. If these creatures are smart enough to evaluate threats and make decisions about how to respond to humans, then they're a lot more than just unknown animals. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there, still watching hunters from the shadows, still trying to understand what we're doing in its forest. And sometimes, when I'm sitting in a tree stand waiting for deer, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me back. Story 5. I got the call at 11:22 p.m. on a Tuesday night in May of 2011. I remember the exact time because I looked at my phone when it rang, annoyed that someone was calling so late. When I saw it was my daughter, my irritation turned to worry immediately. She never called that late unless something was wrong. My daughter was 23 then, living by herself in this little rental house near Florence, Oregon. The place was maybe 15 minutes from the beach, tucked back in the trees on this quiet dead-end road. She'd moved there about 6 months earlier for a job at a local clinic, and she loved the peace and quiet of it. Said it was the first time in her life she'd lived somewhere where she couldn't hear traffic at night. When I answered the phone, I could tell right away she was terrified, not upset, not worried, genuinely scared out of her mind. Her voice was shaking so bad I could barely understand what she was trying to tell me. She kept saying something was outside her bedroom window, something big. At first I thought maybe it was a prowler or someone trying to break in, so I told her to call the police. But then she said it wasn't a person, that it was something else, something that didn't make sense. I was living about 45 minutes away at the time, and I told her I was getting in my car right now to come over. She begged me not to hang up, said she was too scared to be alone on the phone, so I stayed on the line while I got dressed and headed out. The drive felt like it took hours, even though I was going as fast as I dared on those winding back roads. She was still on the phone the whole time, and slowly I started to get more details about what had happened. She said she'd been getting ready for bed around 11 o'clock when she heard these heavy footsteps outside. Not the quick steps of someone walking by, but slow, deliberate footsteps that sounded like something really heavy moving around the back of the house. At first, she thought it might be a neighbor's cow that had gotten loose, or maybe a deer. Her house backed up to dense forest, so it wasn't unusual to see wildlife around. But then she realized the footsteps had a rhythm to them, like something walking on 2 legs instead of 4. She said she turned off the lights and peeked through the bedroom curtains to see what was making the noise. That's when she saw it. According to her, there was something standing right outside her window, maybe 6 feet away from the glass. She described it as huge, completely black, and shaped like a person, but way too big to actually be human. The thing that really got to her was how it filled up most of her view through the window. She said the top of whatever it was reached at least 3 or 4 feet above the bottom of the window frame. That detail stuck with me because I knew her house pretty well, and those windows weren't low to the ground. By the time I got there, she was sitting in her living room with all the lights on, still shaking. I've never seen her so scared, and this is a girl who grew up camping and hiking, who's not afraid of much of anything. She's practical, level-headed, not the type to imagine things or get spooked easily. But that night, she could barely speak coherently. It took me almost an hour to calm her down enough to get the full story. She said the thing had been moving slowly around the back of the house, and every step sounded incredibly heavy. Not like a person walking, but like something that weighed a lot more than any human. She could hear branches breaking and leaves crunching with each step. When she'd looked out the window, it was just standing there, completely still. She couldn't make out any details because it was so dark outside, but she could see this massive black shape that was definitely alive, definitely looking back at her. The worst part, she said, was that it didn't seem surprised to see her. It didn't move away from the window or act startled like a wild animal would. It just stood there calmly, like it was studying her. After a few seconds, it had turned and walked away, but she could hear those heavy footsteps continuing around the house for several more minutes before they faded into the forest. I have to admit, my first instinct was to think she'd seen a bear that had wandered down from the hills. Black bears aren't uncommon in that area, and they can rear up on their hind legs when they're curious about something. From a distance, especially in the dark, a bear standing upright might look humanoid. But when I went outside to check the window where she'd seen the thing, I realized a bear couldn't have been what she'd encountered. I'm 5'4", and when I stood next to that bedroom window, my eyes were just barely level with the bottom edge of the frame. If something had been standing outside that window, with its head 3 or 4 feet above the bottom of the frame, it would have had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. No bear in Oregon gets that big, especially not standing upright. I walked around the back of the house with a flashlight, looking for any sign of what might have been there. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I found several depressions in the earth that could have been footprints. They were hard to make out clearly, but they looked bigger than any human foot and weren't the right shape for bear paws. There were also several broken branches on some of the smaller trees at the edge of the forest, snapped off at a height that would be consistent with something 7 or 8 feet tall pushing through the undergrowth. But the thing that really convinced me that my daughter had seen something unusual was the smell. Even though it had been at least an hour since her encounter, there was still this faint odor hanging in the air around the back of the house. It was musky and wild, with an undertone that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something I couldn't identify. Not overpowering, but definitely noticeable once you caught it. I stayed with her that night, sleeping on her couch with a baseball bat next to me. Neither of us got much sleep. Every little sound outside made us both jump, and there were plenty of normal forest sounds that seemed sinister in the context of what had happened. The next morning in daylight, I did a more thorough investigation of the area around her house. The forest behind her place was incredibly dense. Thick undergrowth, fallen trees, the kind of terrain where something large could easily hide without being detected. I found more broken branches and disturbed vegetation, creating what looked like a path through the trees. Something big had definitely moved through that area recently, pushing aside bushes and small trees that would stop a normal-sized animal. But I also found something else that made my skin crawl. About 50 feet back in the forest, there was this spot where the ground was compressed, like something heavy had been sitting or lying there for an extended period. The depression was roughly human-shaped, but much larger, and it was positioned in a way that would give a clear view of my daughter's house through the trees. The thought that something had been watching her house from the forest, possibly for days or weeks, was deeply disturbing. It suggested a level of intelligence and planning that I didn't want to think about. My daughter moved out of that house within a month of the incident. She said she never felt safe there again, especially after dark. Even with better locks and security lights, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there in the trees, watching and waiting. I helped her pack up her stuff, and I have to admit I was relieved when she found a new place closer to town, somewhere with neighbors nearby and streetlights. The isolation that had initially attracted her to the forest house now seemed like a dangerous liability. But the strangest part of the whole experience was something that didn't happen until we were loading her furniture into the moving truck. I was carrying a box to the truck when I got that feeling you get when someone's watching you. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I had this overwhelming urge to look toward the tree line. I didn't see anything, but I could smell that same musky odor I'd noticed the night of the incident. Faint but unmistakable, and I could feel a presence in those trees, something large and patient and intelligent. My daughter noticed it too. She came up beside me and whispered that she felt like we were being watched. We both stood there for a minute, staring at the forest, but we didn't see any movement or hear any sounds. Still, we finished loading the truck as quickly as possible and got out of there without looking back. It's been over 10 years since that night, and my daughter has never had another encounter like it. She lives in the city now, in the apartment complex with plenty of neighbors and lights, but she still won't go camping or hiking alone, and she gets nervous when she has to drive through heavily forested areas after dark. I've done a lot of research since then about similar encounters in the Pacific Northwest. There are hundreds of reports of large, upright creatures being seen near homes in rural areas, especially houses that back up to dense forest. Most of the witnesses describe the same things my daughter did. Something much taller than a human, covered in dark hair, moving with purpose and intelligence. The thing that bothers me most about our experience is the evidence that the creature had been watching the house for an extended period before my daughter actually saw it. That suggests these things study human behavior, learn our routines, maybe even develop some kind of interest in specific individuals. Why had it chosen to reveal itself that night? Had it been watching her for weeks or months, and something had finally prompted it to get close enough to look through her window? The thought that there might be creatures out there with the intelligence to observe and evaluate humans while remaining hidden from us most of the time is deeply unsettling. It suggests we know a lot less about what lives in our forests than we think we do. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there somewhere, maybe watching other isolated houses, studying other unsuspecting people. And sometimes, when I'm driving through dense forest areas, I catch myself looking into the trees and wondering what might be looking back. My daughter doesn't like to talk about what happened that night, but I know she still thinks about it. She's mentioned having dreams sometimes where she's looking through a window and seeing those same dark shapes moving in the darkness outside. I wish I could tell her it was just her imagination, that she'd seen a bear or a person in dark clothing or shadows playing tricks on her eyes. But I was there. I saw the evidence. I smelled that wild, musky odor and felt that presence watching us from the forest. Whatever she encountered that night was real, and it was something that shouldn't exist according to everything we think we know about the natural world. But it does exist, and it's out there somewhere, moving through the forests of the Pacific Northwest, watching us from the shadows between the trees. The worst part is not knowing what it wanted, or if it's still out there somewhere, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to step out of the darkness and reveal itself again. Story 6. This happened back in September of 2006, and I still can't drive through remote forest areas at night without thinking about it. Me and my friend were coming back from Burns, Oregon, heading to Baker City on Highway 26. It was one of those long, straight stretches of road that cuts through the Malheur National Forest. Miles and miles of nothing but pine trees, and darkness. My friend had this old 1980 Dodge D50 pickup truck that she'd inherited from her grandfather. The thing was a piece of junk, honestly, but it ran decent enough for short trips. The biggest problem was the headlights. They were completely misaligned, pointing down at the road instead of straight ahead like they should. You could only see maybe 30 or 40 feet in front of you, which made night driving pretty nerve-wracking on those winding mountain roads. She'd been complaining about being tired, so somewhere around 10 o'clock, she asked if I wanted to take over driving. I didn't mind. I was wide awake and figured it might be easier for me to deal with the crappy headlights than for her to fight sleep and try to navigate at the same time. The road through that part of Oregon is pretty desolate at night. You might see another car every 20 or 30 minutes if you're lucky. Most of the time, it's just you and the forest, with those tall pines creating walls of darkness on both sides of the highway. The kind of place where if you broke down, you'd be walking for hours before you found any help. We'd been driving for maybe an hour when we came around this sweeping curve, and the headlights lit up something in the road ahead of us. At first glance, I thought it was a person who'd been in an accident or something. There was this figure sitting right in the middle of the highway, directly on the yellow center line. But as we got closer, I realized it wasn't a person at all. The thing was sitting in a crouch with its legs pulled up against its chest and its arms wrapped around its knees. Its head was down between its arms, almost like it was resting or maybe sleeping. The whole creature was covered in thick, reddish-brown hair that looked matted and unkempt. My first thought was that it might be an orangutan, which sounds ridiculous now, but that's honestly what went through my mind in that split second. The hair color was similar, and the posture reminded me of pictures I'd seen of apes in zoos. But we were in the middle of nowhere in eastern Oregon. There's no way an orangutan could have ended up sitting in the road. The truck was riding low, and with those misaligned headlights, I was almost at eye level with the creature as we passed. We couldn't have been more than 10 or 15 feet away from it when we drove by. If I'd wanted to, I could have reached out the window and probably touched it. That's when I got a really good look at what we were dealing with. This wasn't any kind of ape or monkey I'd ever seen. The arms were incredibly long, hanging down past where its feet would be even in that crouched position. The hair was thick and coarse, covering its entire body from head to toe. But the overall shape, the way it was sitting, the proportions, they were more human-like than animal-like. The strangest part was how still it was. Most animals, if they're sitting in the middle of a road at night and a vehicle approaches, they'll either run away or at least look up to see what's coming. This thing didn't move at all. It just sat there with its head down, completely motionless, like it was in some kind of trance or deep sleep. I slowed down a little as we passed, not sure what to expect. Part of me was worried it might suddenly jump up and attack the truck, or that it might be injured and need help. But it never acknowledged our presence. We drove right past it, maybe 5 feet away, and it didn't even lift its head. After we'd gone by, I checked the rearview mirror to see if it was still there. The tail lights gave just enough red glow for me to make out its silhouette, still sitting in exactly the same position in the middle of the road. Then we went around another curve and lost sight of it completely. For the next few minutes, neither of us said anything. I think we were both trying to process what we'd just seen, trying to come up with some rational explanation that would make sense. But there wasn't one. My friend was the first to break the silence. She asked if I'd seen what was in the road, and I told her, yeah, I'd seen it. She asked if I knew what it was, and I had to admit I had no idea. We talked about it for the rest of the drive to Baker City, throwing out theories that got more and more far-fetched as we went. Maybe it was someone in a costume playing a prank, though that seemed unlikely given how remote the area was. Maybe it was a sick or injured animal, though no animal we could think of matched what we'd seen. The thing that really bothered me was the creature's posture. It hadn't been lying down like an animal that was hurt or dying. It had been sitting upright in a very deliberate, almost human-like position. The way its arms were wrapped around its legs, the way its head was resting on its knees, that suggested a level of conscious behavior that you don't usually see in wild animals. When we got to Baker City, we stopped at an all-night diner to get some coffee and decompress. I asked the waitress if she'd ever heard of anyone seeing unusual animals on that stretch of highway, but she just looked at me like I was crazy and said no. We ended up staying in a motel that night instead of driving the rest of the way home. Neither of us felt like getting back on those dark mountain roads, especially knowing that thing might still be out there somewhere. The next morning, we drove back the same way we'd come, partly out of curiosity and partly because it was the most direct route home. When we got to the spot where we'd seen the creature, we pulled over and got out to look around. In daylight, it was just a normal section of highway. Two-lane blacktop with forest on both sides, a few scattered pieces of litter in the ditch. Nothing unusual. But when I stood on the center line where the creature had been sitting, I noticed something that gave me chills. The road surface there was slightly stained, like something wet or oily had been sitting on it for a while. The stain was roughly circular, about the size you'd expect if a large animal had been sitting in that spot for an extended period. There was also a faint odor in the air, musky and wild, with an undertone of something I couldn't identify. My friend noticed it too. She said it smelled like the bear exhibit at the zoo, but different somehow, stronger and more complex, with layers of scent that seemed almost human, but not quite. We didn't stay long. Something about that spot made both of us uncomfortable, even in broad daylight with traffic passing by regularly. It felt like we were trespassing, like we were in a place we weren't supposed to be. On the drive home, we talked more about what we'd experienced. The more we discussed it, the more convinced we became that we'd encountered something that shouldn't exist. The size, the posture, the complete lack of fear when our truck approached. None of it fit with any known animal. I did some research when I got home, looking up reports of unusual animal sightings in eastern Oregon. I was surprised to find several accounts of large, upright creatures being spotted in that same general area over the years. Most of the reports described something similar to what we'd seen, a tall, heavily built creature covered in thick hair, usually spotted near roads or trails at night. But our encounter was different from most of the reports I found. In almost every other case, the creature had been seen walking or running, actively moving through the forest or across roads. We'd found ours just sitting motionless in the middle of the highway, like it was waiting for something or resting. That detail has bothered me for years. Why would a creature like that choose to sit in the middle of a road, especially at night, when vehicles might come along? Was it sick or injured? Was it exhibiting some kind of territorial behavior? Or was there something else going on that I couldn't understand? I've driven that same stretch of highway dozens of times since then, always keeping an eye out for anything unusual. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes I catch myself slowing down when I get to that particular curve, looking for any sign of movement in the trees or shadows on the road. The whole experience changed how I think about wilderness areas. Before that night, I'd always assumed that if there were unknown animals living in our forests, we'd have found concrete evidence of them by now. But seeing that creature sitting in the road, so calm and unafraid of human presence, made me realize that there might be things out there that are a lot better at avoiding detection than we give them credit for. What still gets to me is the memory of how close we were to it. 10 or 15 feet, close enough to see individual strands of hair, close enough to smell its scent, close enough that if it had wanted to interact with us, it easily could have. But it chose not to. It just sat there, head down, completely ignoring our presence. That suggests a level of intelligence and self-control that I find deeply unsettling. If these creatures are smart enough to assess threats and make conscious decisions about how to respond to humans, then they're a lot more than just unknown animals hiding in the forest. Sometimes I wonder if that creature is still out there somewhere, still using that stretch of road for whatever purpose it had that night. Maybe it was a regular behavior, something it did frequently in the hours when traffic was lightest. Maybe we just happened to drive by at the right time to witness something that normally goes unobserved. Or maybe it was waiting for something specific, something that has to do with human behavior or activity in the area. The thought that there might be creatures out there studying our patterns, learning our routines, watching us from the darkness while we remain completely unaware of their presence, is both fascinating and terrifying. My friend and I still talk about that night sometimes, usually when one of us is driving through a remote area after dark. We both agree that we saw something that shouldn't exist according to conventional zoology, but we also both know what we experienced was real. The thing I can't get out of my head is the image of that creature sitting so perfectly still in the middle of the road, head down, arms wrapped around its knees. There was something almost meditative about its posture, like it was engaged in some kind of ritual or behavior that had meaning beyond what we could comprehend. Whatever it was, wherever it came from, it's still out there somewhere. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone through dark forest roads, I find myself hoping I'll see it again, while simultaneously hoping I never do. Story 7. This happened back in September of 2017, and I'm still trying to make sense of it all. I was helping my uncle with the harvest on his farm in southern Illinois, about 20 miles east of Carbondale. It's family land that's been in our name for over a century, mostly corn and soybeans, with some cattle pasture mixed in. Beautiful country, rolling hills covered with crops, but also plenty of wild areas where the land's too rough or wet to farm. My uncle had been complaining about his bad back, so I'd taken a week off work to come help him get the corn in before the weather turned. It was hard work, long days on the combine, but I didn't mind. I grew up on a farm myself before moving to the city, and there's something satisfying about harvest time that you just can't get from an office job. On this particular morning, it was a Tuesday, I remember, because we'd planned to finish the West Field that day. I got up early and walked out to check the fence line before we started combining. The West Field borders a big stretch of timber that runs along a creek bottom, maybe 300 acres of heavy woods that nobody's ever cleared. Deer love to come out of those trees and get into the corn, so we always had problems with broken fences where they'd push through. It had rained lightly the night before, just enough to make the soil soft and muddy in spots. The air was cool and fresh, with that clean smell you get after a rain. Perfect weather for working, not too hot, but warm enough that you wouldn't need a jacket once the sun got up. I was walking along the fence row looking for broken posts or loose wire when I noticed the footprints in the mud. At first, I thought they might be from one of the neighbors' cows that had gotten loose. The prints were big, definitely bigger than a human foot, and they were sunk deep into the soft earth like whatever made them was really heavy. But when I got closer and looked more carefully, I realized these weren't cow tracks at all. They were shaped like human footprints, but huge. I wear a size 11 boot, and when I put my foot next to one of these prints, mine looked like a child's shoe in comparison. The prints had to be at least 18 inches long, maybe 20, and they were wide too. You could clearly see the impression of 5 toes at the front, and the heel was deep and well defined. What really caught my attention was how the prints were arranged. They were in a straight line, like something walking upright on 2 legs. The stride length was incredible, maybe 4 or 5 feet between prints. Whatever had made them was taking steps twice as long as a normal person would. The track line followed the edge of the cornfield for about 100 feet, then turned toward the woods and disappeared into the tall grass at the tree line. I followed them as far as I could, but once they hit the dry grass, I lost the trail completely. I should mention that I've spent a lot of time in the outdoors. I've hunted and fished since I was a kid, and I know what different animal tracks look like. These weren't bear paws, weren't horse hooves, weren't anything I'd ever seen before. They were definitely made by something that walked on 2 feet. Something a lot bigger and heavier than any human. I didn't say anything to my uncle about the tracks right away. I figured he'd probably think I was seeing things or making a big deal out of nothing. Instead, I just kept an eye on that edge of the field while we were working, wondering if whatever had made those prints might come back. We spent most of the day combining corn in the west field, working our way gradually toward the timber. The combine makes a lot of noise, and you're usually focused on keeping straight rows and watching the grain flow, so you don't pay much attention to what's happening around you. But every time I got close to the woods, I found myself looking into the trees, wondering what might be watching me from the shadows. Around 4 o'clock, we took a break for some cold drinks and to check the equipment. My uncle was having trouble with the header on the combine. Some of the gathering chains were acting up, so we spent about an hour working on that. By the time we got it fixed, it was getting close to sunset. That's when things got weird. We just started back up and were maybe 50 yards from the tree line when my uncle shut down the combine and waved me over. He was pointing toward the edge of the woods with this puzzled look on his face. There was something moving in the shadows between the trees. At first, it looked like it might be a deer, but it was too tall, and the movement was all wrong. Whatever it was walking upright on 2 legs, moving slowly but deliberately through the underbrush. We both stood there watching as the thing came closer to the edge of the field. When it finally stepped into a spot where the late afternoon sun was filtering through the canopy, I got a good look at what we were dealing with. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller, with shoulders that had to be 4 feet across. The whole body was covered in dark hair that looked thick and matted, hanging in clumps like it hadn't been groomed in years. The arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees, and its head sat low between its shoulders without much of a neck. But the thing that really got to me was how human-like it looked. The face was hard to make out from that distance, but the overall proportions, the way it stood and moved, were more like a giant person than any kind of animal I'd ever seen. My uncle was the first to speak. He asked if I was seeing what he was seeing, and I told him, yeah, I was definitely seeing it. We both just stood there, maybe 60 or 70 yards away from this creature, watching it watch us. The thing didn't seem aggressive or threatened by our presence. It just stood at the edge of the trees, perfectly still, looking in our direction. I got the impression it was studying us, trying to figure out what we were and whether we posed any kind of threat. After maybe 30 seconds, it turned and walked back into the woods with these long, smooth strides. I could hear branches snapping and leaves rustling as it moved deeper into the forest, but the sounds faded quickly, and then everything was quiet again. Neither of us said anything for a few minutes. We just stood there in the middle of that cornfield, looking at the spot where the creature had disappeared, trying to process what we'd just witnessed. Finally, my uncle broke the silence. He said he'd been farming that land for over 40 years and had never seen anything like what we'd just encountered. He asked if I had any idea what it might have been, and I had to admit I was completely stumped. We talked about calling the sheriff or the state conservation department, but what were we going to tell them? That we'd seen Bigfoot in the cornfield. They'd probably think we'd been drinking or making the whole thing up. Instead, we decided to finish the field and then come back the next morning to look for more evidence. The sun was getting low, and neither of us felt comfortable working that close to the woods once it got dark. We made quick work of the remaining corn, staying well away from the tree line. Every few minutes, I'd glance toward the woods, half expecting to see that creature watching us from the shadows, but I never spotted it again. The next morning, I was out at the field before sunrise, armed with a camera and a tape measure. I wanted to document those footprints before the weather had a chance to wash them away or before some other animal trampled over them. The tracks were still there, clear as day in the dried mud. I took dozens of photos from different angles, measured the length and width of several prints, and even made plaster casts of the two clearest ones. The details were incredible. You could see the texture of skin on the sole, the individual toe impressions, even what looked like wrinkles and creases. I also found something else that made my skin crawl. At the edge of the woods, right where the creature had been standing the day before, there were signs that it had been there for a while. The grass was flattened in a rough circle, like something large had been sitting or lying there for an extended period. There were also several broken branches at about head height for something 8 feet tall, snapped off clean like they'd been grabbed and twisted. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of scratches on one of the oak trees near where the creature had stood. They were deep gouges in the bark, arranged in groups of 4 or 5 parallel lines. The marks were positioned about 7 feet off the ground, too high for any normal animal to reach. The scratches looked fresh, and they were too organized to be accidental damage from a falling branch or something like that. It looked like something with claws or very strong fingernails had deliberately marked that tree, maybe as some kind of territorial sign. I showed all this evidence to my uncle when he arrived later that morning. He was as baffled as I was, but he agreed that we'd definitely encountered something unusual. We decided to set up a trail camera in the woods to see if we could capture more evidence of whatever was living back there. That night, we heard it again. I was staying in my uncle's guest room, which faces the west field and the timber beyond. Around 2 in the morning, I was awakened by what sounded like someone screaming in the distance. Not a human scream, but something deeper and more powerful, echoing through the woods, like the call of some prehistoric beast. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped abruptly. I lay in bed listening, my heart pounding, wondering if I'd dreamed it. Then it came again, even louder this time, and I knew I was definitely awake. I got up and looked out the window toward the field. The moon was about 3/4 full, providing enough light to see the general outline of the landscape. At first, everything looked normal, but then I saw movement near the tree line. Something tall and dark was walking along the edge of the woods, moving with that same smooth, deliberate gait I'd observed the day before. It would pause every few steps, turn toward the house, then continue on its path. It was too far away and too dark for me to make out any details, but there was no question about what I was looking at. I wanted to wake my uncle, but I was afraid that by the time I got him up and back to the window, the creature would be gone. Instead, I just watched as it made its way along the field edge, occasionally stopping to look in the direction of the house. After maybe 10 minutes, it disappeared back into the woods, and I didn't see or hear anything else for the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked our trail camera and found that it had been triggered multiple times during the night. Most of the photos just showed empty forest, but there were 3 images that made my blood run cold. The first showed a massive figure walking past the camera, its body filling most of the frame. The second caught it turning to look directly at the camera, its eyes reflecting the infrared flash like 2 glowing orbs. The third showed it reaching toward the camera with one enormously long arm. The detail in these photos was incredible. You could see the texture of its hair, the muscle definition in its shoulders and arms, even the expression on its face. It looked curious rather than aggressive, tilting its head slightly like it was trying to figure out what the camera was. But here's the thing that really freaked me out. After those 3 photos, the camera stopped working. When we went to check it later that morning, we found it had been moved about 10 feet from where we'd mounted it and was sitting neatly on the ground, completely undamaged, but somehow disabled. It was like the creature had examined the camera, figured out what it was, and then carefully removed it without breaking it. That suggested a level of intelligence that I found deeply unsettling. My uncle and I spent the rest of that week nervously finishing the harvest, always keeping one eye on the woods. We never saw the creature again during daylight hours, but several times we heard those deep, echoing calls coming from the timber, usually late at night or very early in the morning. When I finally packed up to head home, I was almost relieved to be leaving. The constant feeling of being watched, of being studied by something I couldn't understand, had worn me down. Every shadow looked suspicious. Every sound made me jump. But I also felt like I was leaving behind one of the most significant experiences of my life. How many people get to encounter something that science says doesn't exist? How many people get photographic evidence of a creature that's supposed to be nothing more than folklore and legend? I still have those photos, and I still have the plaster casts of those massive footprints. Sometimes I take them out and look at them, reminding myself that what happened on my uncle's farm was real, not some kind of hallucination or wishful thinking. My uncle still farms that land, but he's told me that he doesn't work the West Field alone anymore. He always brings help, and he never stays out there after dark. He's heard those calls from the woods several more times, and he's found more tracks along the creek bottom, but he's never seen the creature again, face to face. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, living in those 300 acres of timber, watching the farm activities from the safety of the forest. Maybe it's learned to be more careful around humans after our encounters, more secretive about its movements and habits. The thing that bothers me most is the intelligence it displayed. The way it examined our trail camera, the way it seemed to study us before revealing itself, the deliberate marks it left on that oak tree. All of that suggests we're dealing with something far more sophisticated than just an unknown animal species. And if these creatures are that smart, if they're capable of learning and adapting their behavior based on human activity, then there might be a lot more of them out there than anyone realizes. They're just better at staying hidden than we are at finding them. Story 8. This happened back in August of 2004, and I still get chills every time I drive through that part of Tennessee. I was working some private land near the Sipsy River in the southern part of the state, right close to the Alabama border. The landowner had hired me to do some field work, plowing and disking about 200 acres that he wanted to get ready for fall planting. It was good work, decent pay, and I enjoyed being outdoors on the tractor all day. The property was beautiful country, rolling hills covered with a mix of farmland and thick forest, with the Sipsy River winding through the bottom lands. Remote as hell, though. The nearest neighbor had to be 5 miles away, and you could go all day without seeing another soul. I'd been working there for about a week, putting in 10-hour days to get the job done before the weather turned. This particular day was a scorcher, had to be pushing 95 degrees with humidity that made your clothes stick to your skin. I'd started early, around 6 in the morning, trying to get as much done as possible before the heat became unbearable. By late afternoon, I was beat. The old John Deere I was running didn't have air conditioning, just a canvas canopy to keep the sun off, so I'd been baking in that seat all day. Around 5:30, I decided to call it quits and head home. I'd put in a good day's work, and the heat was starting to make me dizzy. The dirt road that led back to the main highway wound through some pretty thick timber, following the contours of the hills and crossing a couple of small creeks. It wasn't much more than 2 ruts with grass growing between them, but it was the only way in and out of the property. I was driving my pickup truck, an old Ford F-150 that had seen better days but still ran good. The windows were down, trying to catch any breeze I could find, and I was looking forward to getting home to a cold beer and a shower. That's when I saw it. I was coming around a curve where the road dips down toward one of the creek crossings when something ran across the road maybe 20 feet in front of my truck. At first glance, I thought it might be a person, maybe someone who'd been swimming in the creek and was running back to their clothes. But as my brain processed what I was seeing, I realized this wasn't any person I'd ever encountered. The thing was huge, had to be 6 or 7 feet tall, and completely covered in black hair that was hanging in long, wet clumps all over its body. It was running upright on 2 legs, but the proportions were all wrong for a human. The shoulders were incredibly broad, the arms were way too long, and the head seemed too small for the massive body. But here's what really got my attention. It looked straight at me as it crossed the road. We made eye contact for maybe 2 seconds, but it felt like much longer. The creature turned its head toward my truck as it ran, and I got a clear look at its face. Dark skin, broad, flat nose, and eyes that seemed too intelligent for any animal I'd ever seen. It wasn't panicked or startled like most animals would be when surprised by a vehicle. It just looked at me with this calm, measuring stare, like it was evaluating whether I was a threat. The whole encounter lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds from start to finish. The creature ran from the right side of the road to the left, covering that distance in just a few long strides. I could hear it crashing through the brush and saplings on the left side of the road as it disappeared into the forest, branches snapping and leaves rustling as it moved away from the road. I stopped my truck right there in the middle of the road and just sat for a minute, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel and my heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon. The thing had been coming from the direction of the river, and its hair was definitely wet, hanging in stringy clumps like it had just climbed out of the water. That explained why it looked so dark. Wet hair always looks darker than dry hair. But even accounting for that, this creature was covered in hair so black it was almost like looking at a shadow with substance. What struck me most was how muscular it looked. This wasn't some skinny, malnourished animal. It had the build of something incredibly strong, with thick arms and legs and a barrel chest that suggested serious physical power. The way it moved, too. There was nothing awkward or clumsy about its gait. It ran with the smooth coordination of something perfectly adapted to moving through rough terrain. But the face is what I can't get out of my head. It was definitely more human-like than ape-like, with a broad nose and what looked like fairly small eyes set deep under a pronounced brow ridge. The hair around the face was shorter than on the rest of the body, and I could see dark skin underneath. When it looked at me, there was something in those eyes that suggested intelligence, maybe even curiosity. After sitting there for a couple minutes, I finally worked up the nerve to get out of the truck and take a look at where the creature had crossed. The road surface was hard-packed dirt and gravel, so there weren't any clear footprints, but I could see where something had disturbed the loose gravel and scattered some of the smaller stones. On the left side of the road, where it had entered the forest, there was obvious sign of something large crashing through the underbrush, broken branches, crushed vegetation, a clear path through the saplings and briars. Whatever had made that trail was definitely big and powerful enough to push through obstacles that would stop most animals. I followed the trail for maybe 50 feet into the woods before I lost it in the thicker timber. But even in that short distance, I could see that whatever I'd encountered was moving with purpose, not just running randomly through the forest. The path was fairly straight, heading deeper into the woods toward what I knew was a series of ridges and hollows that stretched for miles. That's when I noticed the smell. Standing there in the woods, following that trail of broken vegetation, I became aware of an odor that definitely hadn't been there when I first got out of my truck. It was musky and wild, with an undertone that reminded me of wet dog mixed with something sharper and more organic. Not overpowering, but strong enough that once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it. The smell seemed to be concentrated along the path the creature had taken, like it had left some kind of scent trail as it moved through the forest. I'd never encountered anything like it before. It was definitely animal in nature, but unlike any wildlife scent I was familiar with. I didn't stay in the woods long. Something about that smell, combined with the thought that the creature might still be nearby, made me nervous about being away from my truck. I backtracked to the road and got back in the cab, but I sat there for several more minutes trying to process what had just happened. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I'd seen something extraordinary. The size, the build, the way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes. None of it fit with any known animal species in Tennessee. Black bears can rear up on their hind legs, but they don't run that way, and they certainly don't have the body proportions I'd observed. Earlier that summer, I'd actually found some unusual footprints along the riverbank where I sometimes ate my lunch. At the time, I'd figured they were probably made by someone fishing or swimming, but they'd been bigger than normal human prints and deeper, like they'd been made by something heavier than the average person. Now, thinking back on those prints, I wondered if they might have been made by the same creature I'd just encountered. The timeline would fit. I'd found the prints maybe 2 weeks earlier, and they'd been in soft mud right along the water's edge where something might have been drinking or fishing. The area where all this happened is incredibly remote and heavily forested. The Sipsy River winds through thousands of acres of undeveloped timber with swamps and bottomlands that would be nearly impossible for humans to navigate. If there were unknown animals living in that region, they'd have plenty of territory to roam without ever encountering people. When I finally drove home that evening, I didn't mention the encounter to my wife or anyone else. Who was I going to tell? That I'd seen Bigfoot running across a dirt road in southern Tennessee? Most people would have thought I'd been out in the sun too long, or maybe had a few beers during my lunch break. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it was real. Over the next few days, I kept thinking about that moment when the creature had looked at me. There had been something almost familiar about the interaction. Not familiar in the sense that I'd seen the creature before, but familiar in the way that you might make eye contact with another person and have a moment of mutual recognition. It sounds crazy, but I got the impression that the creature had been just as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Like maybe it had been crossing that road regularly, maybe for years, without ever encountering a human. Our paths had intersected by pure chance, and we'd both been caught off guard. The thought that this thing might have been using that road crossing on a regular basis was both fascinating and unsettling. How many times had it made that same trip from the river to wherever it was going in the forest? How long had it been living in that area without anyone knowing about it? I finished up the work on that property about a week later, but I made sure to leave well before dark every day. I didn't want to risk another encounter, especially not when the light was fading and I might not be able to see clearly. During daylight hours, I felt reasonably safe, but something about that creature and the way it had looked at me suggested it might be more active after dark. On my last day of work, I drove back to the spot where I'd seen the creature cross the road. In broad daylight, it looked like any other stretch of rural road, nothing special or unusual about it. But I could still see the broken vegetation where it had entered the forest, and when I got out of my truck, I could catch just a faint whiff of that same musky odor. I walked into the woods one more time, following that trail of disturbed brush and broken branches. It was still clearly visible, even after a week of weather and natural settling. Whatever had made that path was heavy enough and powerful enough to leave permanent sign of its passage. About 100 feet into the forest, I found something that made my skin crawl. There was a tree, maybe 8 inches in diameter, that had been broken off about 6 feet from the ground. Not cut with a saw or axe, but snapped off like someone had grabbed it and twisted until the trunk gave way. The break was clean and recent, with fresh wood exposed where the tree had been torn apart. I'm a pretty strong guy, and I've done my share of manual labor, but I couldn't have broken a tree that size with my bare hands. It would take incredible strength to snap a healthy trunk like that, more strength than any human possesses. Standing there looking at that broken tree, I realized I was probably looking at evidence of just how powerful the creature I'd encountered really was. If it could break trees like that without any tools, what could it do to a human if it wanted to? That thought sent me back to my truck in a hurry. I've been back to that area several times since then, usually during hunting season when I have reason to be in the woods. I've never seen the creature again, but I've found more sign that suggests it's still living somewhere in that vast stretch of forest. More broken trees, always snapped off at about the same height. More unusual footprints in the soft mud along the riverbank, bigger than any human foot and deeper than they should be. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, I catch a faint trace of that same musky scent I first noticed that day in the woods. The thing that bothers me most about the whole experience is how normal it seemed in the moment. Here I was, face to face with something that shouldn't exist according to conventional zoology, and it felt almost routine, like this was just another wild animal crossing the road, nothing more unusual than seeing a deer or a turkey. It's only in hindsight that I realize how extraordinary the encounter was. At the time, my brain was just trying to process what I was seeing, categorize it, make sense of it in terms of my existing knowledge of wildlife. It took hours for the full impact to hit me, for me to understand that I'd probably seen something that science says doesn't exist. But I know what I saw that day on that dirt road near the Sipsy River. I know that creature was real, and I know it's still out there somewhere in those thousands of acres of forest and swampland. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever see it again, and sometimes I hope I never do. Because even though the encounter wasn't threatening, even though the creature seemed more curious than aggressive, there was something about its size and strength and intelligence that I found deeply unsettling. The thought that there are things living in our forests that we don't understand, things that are smart enough to avoid human contact most of the time, makes me look at wilderness areas very differently now. And sometimes, when I'm driving through remote areas at dusk, I find myself watching the road ahead more carefully, wondering what might come running out of the trees. Story 9. This happened back in February of 2000, and I'm telling you right now, it's the reason I don't go out in the woods at night anymore. I was 19 then, stupid and fearless like most teenagers, and I thought I could handle anything the world threw at me. Boy, was I wrong. Me and my buddy were heading out to visit this girl who lived in a pretty remote area near Florence, Oregon. It was around 1:30 in the morning on a Saturday night, and we'd been hanging out in town when she called and asked if we wanted to come over. She lived maybe 15 minutes outside of town, but the last part of the trip was on this dirt road that wound through some seriously thick forest. We'd made this trip plenty of times before, usually in my friend's car. But that night his car was in the shop, so we took his motorcycle instead. It was an old Honda, nothing fancy, but it ran good and got us where we needed to go. The problem was, it only seated 2 people, so we had to ride together. The first part of the ride was normal. Paved roads, streetlights, the usual stuff you'd expect near town. But once we turned off onto the dirt road, everything changed. The trees closed in on both sides, creating this tunnel effect where you could barely see the sky above. The bike's headlight only cut through maybe 20 or 30 feet of darkness ahead of us, so you really had to trust that the road kept going straight. We'd gone maybe half a mile down this dirt road when we heard the first sounds. At first, I thought it might be another vehicle somewhere behind us, but when I looked back, I couldn't see any headlights. The sounds were coming from off to our right, from what I knew was a swampy area with a lot of standing water and thick underbrush. Heavy footsteps, definitely something big moving through the marshy ground. The weird thing was the rhythm. It wasn't the random splashing and crashing you'd expect from a deer or elk moving through a swamp. These footsteps were regular, measured, like something walking upright on 2 legs. Each step was followed by a pause, then another step, then another pause. Very deliberate, very controlled. My friend heard it too. He slowed the bike down, and we both listened, trying to figure out what we were dealing with. The footsteps seemed to be getting closer, moving parallel to the road but heading in our direction. Whatever was making the noise was big enough that each step created this deep, sucking sound as it pulled its feet out of the mud. That's when my friend made the decision to pull over and hide. He cut the engine and the headlight, and we quickly pushed the bike off the road into some bushes where we hoped it wouldn't be visible. The sudden silence and darkness was almost overwhelming. You don't realize how much you depend on those mechanical sounds and lights until they're gone. We crouched down in the brush and waited, listening to those footsteps get closer and closer. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure whatever was out there would be able to hear it. The footsteps were definitely moving faster now, and they sounded like they were heading straight for the road. The scariest part was that we could hear breathing, deep, heavy breathing that matched the rhythm of the footsteps. Not the quick, panicked breathing of an animal being chased, but slow, controlled breaths like something that was working hard but wasn't in any hurry. We stayed hidden in those bushes for what felt like hours, but was probably only 5 or 10 minutes. The footsteps kept getting louder, and I started to worry that whatever was making them was going to find us crouched there. The breathing was so loud now that it seemed like the thing had to be just a few yards away. Then my friend lost his nerve and decided we needed to get out of there. He jumped up and started trying to get the bike started, but in his panic, he flooded the engine. The bike wouldn't turn over, and with each failed attempt, the starter motor got weaker and weaker. I was standing next to him, frantically looking around, expecting to see something huge come crashing out of the swamp at any second. The footsteps had stopped when my friend first tried to start the bike, but now I could hear movement again, branches breaking, water splashing, the sound of something large pushing through thick vegetation, and it was definitely coming toward us. Finally, the bike caught and roared to life. My friend didn't even wait for me to get on properly. He started moving as soon as the engine fired up, and I had to jump on the back while we were already rolling. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold. As we were accelerating down that dirt road, I heard this deep breathing sound that seemed to be keeping pace with us, not behind us, but right next to us, like something was running alongside the motorcycle in the darkness, just beyond the reach of our headlight. The breathing was rhythmic, matching the sound of our engine, and it was coming from something that had to be huge to make that much noise. I couldn't see anything in the darkness, but I could hear branches snapping and undergrowth being crushed as whatever it was moved through the forest parallel to the road. Then my friend hit a low branch with his helmet and nearly knocked himself silly. The branch came out of nowhere. We were going maybe 25 miles per hour, focused on the road ahead, when this thick limb caught him right across the forehead. The impact almost knocked him off the bike, and for a second I thought we were going to crash. He managed to stay upright, but the blow left him dazed and bleeding. I had to grab the handlebars to help keep us steady while he shook his head and tried to clear his vision. We slowed down considerably, and that's when things got really terrifying. The breathing sounds were still there, still keeping pace with us, but now I could hear something else. Heavy footsteps, but not the slogging sound of something moving through swamp water. These were the solid, rhythmic steps of something running on firm ground. I looked back over my shoulder and saw something that I still have nightmares about. There was this massive shape moving through the forest behind us, silhouetted against the slightly lighter sky between the trees. It was running upright on 2 legs, covering ground with these incredibly long strides. Even in the darkness, I could see that it was much taller and broader than any human, with arms that swung as it ran like a person would, but proportions that were all wrong. The thing was keeping up with our motorcycle without any apparent effort. We were still doing maybe 15 or 20 miles per hour, and this creature was matching our pace while running through thick forest that would have stopped most animals cold. Then it did something that I'll never forget as long as I live. The creature came to the edge of the forest where it met the road, and instead of following the road like we were, it jumped. One single leap that carried it from the forest on one side of the road to the forest on the other side, a distance that had to be at least 12 feet. It landed in the trees on the left side of the road and immediately started running again, continuing to keep pace with our motorcycle. I heard it hit the ground with this heavy thud, heard branches breaking as it pushed through the underbrush, heard that same deep, controlled breathing. The moon was almost full that night, and when the creature had jumped across the road, it had been silhouetted against the sky for just a second. That brief glimpse gave me a clear look at what we were dealing with, and it wasn't anything I'd ever seen before or since. The thing was massively built, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with shoulders that had to be 4 feet across. Its whole body was covered in what looked like thick, dark hair that seemed to flow as it moved. The arms were incredibly long, hanging down almost to its knees, and they pumped back and forth as it ran like a human sprinter would. But it was the way it moved that really got to me. There was nothing awkward or clumsy about its gait. It ran with the fluid grace of something perfectly adapted to moving through rough terrain at high speed. This wasn't some random animal that had wandered into an unusual situation. This was something that belonged in those forests, something that knew exactly what it was doing. My friend had recovered enough from the branch impact to get us moving faster, and we started pulling away from whatever was chasing us. The breathing sounds gradually faded, and the sound of breaking branches got more distant. By the time we reached the paved road, I couldn't hear anything behind us anymore, except the sound of our own engine. We made it to the girls' house, but neither of us was in any mood to hang out anymore. My friend's forehead was bleeding from where the branch had hit him, and both of us were shaking from adrenaline and fear. We told her we had to get home, made some excuse about my friend needing to see a doctor about his head injury. The ride back to town was the longest 20 minutes of my life. We took the main highway instead of the dirt road, adding maybe 10 miles to the trip, but keeping us on well-lit pavement with regular traffic. Neither of us wanted to go back through those dark woods, not after what we'd experienced. We didn't talk about what had happened until we got back to town and were sitting in the parking lot of an all-night diner, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what we'd been through. My friend admitted he'd seen the creature jump across the road, same as me. He described it almost exactly the way I remembered it. Huge, covered in dark hair, moving with impossible speed and agility through terrain that should have slowed it down. But the thing that really freaked both of us out was how intelligent it had seemed. This wasn't just some big animal that had been startled by our motorcycle and decided to chase us. The way it had moved, the way it had anticipated our route and paralleled us through the forest, suggested a level of planning and problem-solving that you don't usually associate with wildlife. It was like the creature had been studying our behavior, figuring out where we were going and what we were likely to do next. When we'd stopped to hide in the bushes, it had approached our location deliberately, not randomly. When we'd started moving again, it had immediately adapted its strategy to keep up with us. Over the next few days, I did some research at the local library, looking up reports of unusual animal sightings in the Florence area. I was surprised to find quite a few accounts of large, upright creatures being spotted in the forests around there, going back for decades. Most of the reports described something similar to what we'd encountered. A tall, powerfully built creature covered in dark hair, usually seen at night near roads or trails. Several witnesses mentioned the incredible speed and agility these things displayed, their ability to move through thick forest without being slowed down by obstacles that would stop most animals. But our encounter was different from most of the reports I found in one important way. In almost every other case, the creature had been seen briefly and then disappeared. We'd had a sustained interaction that lasted several minutes, with the thing actively pursuing us over a considerable distance, That suggested either that we'd encountered something more aggressive than usual, or that we'd stumbled into a situation where the creature felt threatened or territorial about that particular area. I went back to that stretch of road a few weeks later, during daylight, and with several friends along for backup. I wanted to see if I could find any physical evidence of what we'd experienced. Footprints, broken vegetation, anything that might confirm that the whole thing hadn't been some kind of shared hallucination. The swampy area where we'd first heard the footsteps was too muddy and overgrown to show clear tracks, but I did find several places along the road where large branches had been broken at about the height you'd expect if something 7 or 8 feet tall had been pushing through the underbrush. I also found what might have been footprints in a patch of soft earth near where the creature had jumped across the road. They were partially obscured by rain and wind, but they looked like they might have been made by something with feet much larger than a human's. The most convincing evidence was a tree on the left side of the road that had been damaged in a way I'd never seen before. Several branches had been broken off at a height of about 8 feet, snapped cleanly, like they'd been grabbed and twisted by something with incredible strength. The breaks were fresh, probably made within the past few weeks, and they were positioned in a way that suggested whatever had caused the damage had been moving at high speed through the forest, grabbing and breaking branches without slowing down. Standing there in broad daylight, looking at that damaged tree and those possible footprints, I knew that what my friend and I had experienced was real. We'd encountered something that shouldn't exist according to conventional zoology, but the evidence was right there in front of me. I've been back to that area many times since then, usually during hunting season when I have a legitimate reason to be in the woods. I've never had another encounter like that night in February, but I've found more sign that suggests these creatures are still active in the area. More damaged trees, always broken at about the same height. More possible footprints in soft ground, larger and deeper than any human would make. And sometimes, when I'm sitting quietly in the woods, I catch a whiff of an odor that reminds me of that night. Musky, wild, with an undertone of something I can't quite identify. But I've never gone back to those woods at night, and I never will. Whatever chased my friend and me that February evening is still out there somewhere, and I have no desire to find out what it might do if it encounters humans again. The thing that bothers me most about the whole experience is how effortlessly the creature had kept up with our motorcycle. We were moving at 15 to 20 miles per hour through terrain that should have given us a significant advantage, but it had matched our pace without any apparent difficulty. That suggests these things are not only much stronger and faster than humans, but also much more intelligent than most people realize. If they can adapt their behavior that quickly to new situations, if they can problem solve and strategize in real time, then they're a lot more than just unknown animals hiding in the forest. They're something else entirely, something that challenges everything we think we know about the natural world. And they're out there right now, moving through the darkness between the trees, watching and learning and waiting for the next time our paths cross theirs. Story 10. I lived on my family's farm property in Alabama from 1999 to 2000, and what happened there still keeps me up at night sometimes. The land had been in our family for generations, about 300 acres of rolling hills, mostly covered in thick forest with deep valleys that connected to a river system running through the area. Beautiful country, but isolated as hell. The nearest neighbor was probably 2 miles away, and when you were down in those valleys, you felt like you were 1,000,000 miles from civilization. The old farmhouse where my grandparents used to live had been sitting empty for a few years before I moved in. It needed work, but the bones were solid, and I liked the idea of fixing up a piece of family history. The house sat on a hill overlooking the main pasture, with forests stretching out in every direction beyond the cleared land. It started in late summer of 1999. I'd been living there for maybe 2 months when I first heard the screams. I was sitting on the back porch one evening, probably around 11 o'clock, just enjoying the quiet and the cool night air. The sounds came from deep in the forest toward the river, maybe half a mile away. At first, I thought it might be a peacock. My grandmother used to keep peacocks, and their calls can sound almost human if you don't know what you're hearing. But these screams were different, deeper, more powerful, with a quality that made my chest vibrate even from that distance. They'd start low and build to this incredible volume, echoing through the valleys like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not the quick, sharp cry of a bird, but long, sustained calls that seemed to go on forever. The screams would come in groups of 3 or 4, with long pauses between each group. Sometimes I'd wait 10 or 15 minutes between calls, just long enough to think it was over. Then they'd start up again, always from the same general direction, always with that same haunting quality that made the hair on my arms stand up. My dog didn't like the sounds either. I had a Doberman named Rex, a big, confident dog who wasn't afraid of much of anything, but when those screams echoed through the forest, he'd start whimpering and pressing himself against my legs, looking toward the trees with his ears flat against his head. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just some kind of wildlife I wasn't familiar with. Alabama has owls, hawks, maybe even the occasional bobcat. But I grew up in the country, and I'd never heard anything like these calls before. The screaming went on sporadically for a couple weeks, always at night, always from the same area of forest. Sometimes I wouldn't hear anything for 3 or 4 days. Then it would start up again, just when I was beginning to think whatever was making the noise had moved on. Then one night in early fall, around 11:30, something changed. I was walking back from checking on some equipment at the far end of the property when I got that feeling. You know the one. When every instinct you have starts screaming that something's wrong, that you're in danger. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My skin started crawling, and I had this overwhelming urge to get back to the house as fast as possible. Rex was with me, and he started acting strange too. He began whining and looking back over his shoulder toward the forest, like something was following us. His hackles were up, and he kept trying to position himself between me and whatever he thought was back there. That's when I heard the first scream, much closer than usual. It came from maybe 50 yards behind us, somewhere in the tree line that bordered the pasture. The sound was so loud and so close that it made my ears ring, and I could feel it in my chest, like standing next to a powerful stereo speaker. Rex let out this pitiful whine and practically glued himself to my legs. I had my rifle with me, a .30-30 that I always carried when walking the property at night, and I turned around with it ready, looking toward where the sound had come from. The moon was pretty bright that night, and I could see the edge of the forest clearly, but I didn't see any movement. Then the thing screamed again, even closer this time. The sound came from directly behind us, maybe 30 yards away, and it was so powerful that Rex and I both jumped. That's when I knew for sure we were being followed by something big, something that could move through the forest without making any noise until it wanted to be heard. We ran for the house, not jogged, not walked quickly, ran like our lives depended on it. Rex kept looking back and whimpering, and I kept expecting to hear footsteps or crashing brush behind us. But there was nothing, just silence, which somehow made it worse. The screaming continued while we ran, coming from different locations around us, like whatever was making the noise was moving to keep pace with us. One call from the left, then one from behind, then one from the right, like we were being surrounded. We made it to the house, and I locked every door and window, something I'd never felt the need to do before. Rex wouldn't leave my side for the rest of the night, and every little sound outside made both of us jump. The calls continued for another hour or so, but they gradually moved away from the house and back toward the deeper forest. By around 2 in the morning, everything was quiet again. That was the first time I really understood that I wasn't alone on that property. Over the next few weeks, the encounters escalated. The screaming became more frequent, and it started happening closer to the house. Sometimes I'd hear it right outside my bedroom windows in the middle of the night, so close and so loud that it would wake me from a dead sleep. But the worst incident happened on a clear night in late October. I was bringing laundry in from the line. I know that sounds mundane, but it's these ordinary moments that make the story real. It was probably around 9:30, early enough that I wasn't worried about being outside, but late enough that the sun had been down for a while. I had my arms full of sheets and towels, making my way from the clothesline back toward the house, when I heard something that made me freeze in place. Heavy breathing. Not from far away in the forest, but close, really close, like something was standing just outside the circle of light from my porch lamp watching me. I stopped and listened, trying to pinpoint where the breathing was coming from. It was slow and deep, the kind of breathing you'd hear from something really big exerting itself. Each exhale was clearly audible, and there was this slight wheeze to it, like whatever was making the sound had been running. Then I heard the gate. The pasture gate was probably 50 yards from the house, and it had this distinctive creak when it opened. I'd been meaning to oil the hinges for weeks, but hadn't gotten around to it. That night, I heard the gate creak open, then swing shut with a clang that echoed across the pasture. Something had just entered the area around my house. I dropped the laundry and ran for the porch, fumbling for my keys to get inside. Behind me, I could hear footsteps in the gravel driveway, not the quick steps of a person hurrying, but slow, deliberate steps like something heavy taking its time. I got the door unlocked and threw myself inside, slamming it behind me and turning the deadbolt. Rex was already there waiting for me, whining and pacing back and forth in front of the door. That's when I heard the scream, so close and so loud that the windows in the house rattled. Whatever was outside was standing maybe 10 feet from my front door, and it was making noise like nothing I'd ever experienced. The scream went on for what felt like a full minute, rising and falling in volume, but never stopping completely. It was like the thing was announcing its presence, letting me know it was there and it was in charge. I grabbed my rifle and went to the front window, peering out through a gap in the curtains. The porch light was on, creating a circle of visibility maybe 20 feet in diameter, but beyond that, everything was black. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the empty porch, the gravel driveway, the pasture gate standing open like I'd heard. But then something moved at the very edge of the light. A shadow, tall, much taller than a person, standing just outside the reach of the porch light. It wasn't moving, just standing there like it was watching the house, waiting for something. I couldn't make out any details. It was too dark and too far away, but the shape was definitely upright, definitely much bigger than any person. The shoulders were incredibly broad, and what I assumed was its head was positioned low between them, giving it this hulking, powerful appearance. We stared at each other for maybe 5 minutes, me from inside the house and this thing from the edge of my porch light. It never moved closer, never made any threatening gestures, just stood there watching. But there was something about its posture that suggested intelligence, like it was studying me and the house, trying to figure something out. Then, without any warning, it stepped backward into the darkness and disappeared. One moment it was there. The next it was gone, like it had never existed at all. But I could still hear it moving around outside, footsteps in the gravel, the creak of the gate opening and closing again, more of that heavy breathing. Whatever it was, it spent the next couple hours circling the house, always staying just outside the range of my porch light. Rex and I huddled in the living room with the rifle, jumping at every sound. Sometimes the footsteps would stop right outside a window, and I'd see the shadow of something tall moving past the glass. Other times, I'd hear what sounded like scratching or tapping on the walls, like the thing was testing the structure of the house. Around 1:30 in the morning, everything went quiet. The footsteps stopped, the breathing stopped, and even the normal night sounds seemed muted. It was like someone had turned down the volume on the entire world. I waited another hour before I worked up the courage to look outside again. The pasture gate was closed, the driveway was empty, and there was no sign that anything unusual had happened. If it weren't for the laundry still scattered on the ground where I dropped it, I might have thought the whole thing was a nightmare. But when I went outside the next morning to survey the area, I found evidence that my visitor had been real. There were footprints in the soft earth around the house. Huge footprints, at least twice the size of my boot, with clearly defined toes and what looked like the impression of a heel. The prints were deep, like they'd been made by something incredibly heavy, and they formed a rough circle around the entire house. I also found scratches on the outside walls, particularly around the windows. Deep gouges in the wood siding, arranged in groups of 4 or 5 parallel lines. The marks were positioned about 8 or 9 feet off the ground, higher than any normal animal could reach. The pasture gate had been bent, not broken, but warped, like something with incredible strength had grabbed it and twisted it partially out of shape. The metal was actually creased where fingers, or something like fingers, had gripped it. But the most disturbing discovery was on the back porch. My grandmother's old rocking chair, which had been sitting in the same spot for years, had been moved. Not knocked over or broken, just picked up and repositioned about 10 feet from where it normally sat. It was facing the back door, like someone had been sitting in it watching the house. The thought that this thing had been sitting on my porch, maybe for hours just watching and waiting, made my skin crawl. What had it been thinking about? What had it wanted? I moved off the property within 2 weeks of that encounter. I told myself it was because I'd gotten a job offer in Birmingham, which was true, but the real reason was that I couldn't handle living there anymore. Every night was an ordeal, wondering if that thing would come back, wondering what it might do if it decided I was a threat. I came back to visit the property a few times over the years, usually during the day and always with company. The house eventually fell into disrepair and had to be torn down, but the land is still in the family. Sometimes relatives ask me why I don't move back out there, fix up a new house, enjoy the peace and quiet of country living. I always make up some excuse about preferring city life, but the truth is, I'm afraid of what's still living in those 300 acres of forest. I know it sounds crazy, but I believe that thing is still there, still roaming those valleys and ridges, still watching anyone who ventures too far into its territory. The screaming stopped after I moved away, at least according to the neighbors who would have been able to hear it from their farms. Either the creature moved on to some other area, or it just didn't feel the need to vocalize anymore once the threat, me, had been eliminated. But sometimes, when I'm driving through rural Alabama and I see thick forest stretching away from the road, I catch myself listening for those deep, powerful calls that used to echo through the valleys around my family's old farm. And sometimes, late at night when the city is quiet, I swear I can still hear them. Story 11. This happened in October of 2009. And I'm telling you right now, it changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in the woods around my property. I've been living in Wayne County, Tennessee for most of my adult life, about 15 miles outside of town, on a piece of land that backs up to some seriously thick forest. The kind of place where you can walk for miles without seeing another human being, where the trees grow so dense that even in the middle of the day, it's dim and shadowy between them. I've always been comfortable in the woods. Grew up hunting and fishing, spent countless hours tracking deer and turkey through terrain that would turn most city folks around in circles. I thought I knew every sound, every smell, every sign that the forest could throw at me. Boy, was I wrong. It was a Tuesday morning, probably around 11 o'clock, and I was out on my ATV checking the gas pipeline trails that cut through the hills near my property. The gas company maintains these cleared paths for their equipment, and they make perfect trails for getting back into areas that would be almost impossible to reach on foot. I'd been riding for maybe an hour, just enjoying the crisp fall weather and the colors of the changing leaves. The trail I was on follows the ridgeline for several miles, winding through some of the most remote country in this part of Tennessee. There are places back there where you can't even hear the highway traffic, where the only sounds are wind through the trees and maybe the occasional bird call. Peaceful country, the kind of place where you can really clear your head and forget about the stress of everyday life. I came over a small rise in the trail and was heading down into a little valley when I saw it. There was something standing in a clearing, maybe 100 yards ahead of me, right next to where the trail makes a sharp turn to the left. At first glance, I thought it might be a person, maybe another ATV rider who'd stopped to check his bearings or take a break. But as I got closer, I realized this wasn't any person I'd ever seen before. The thing was huge, easily 7.5 to 8 feet tall, with shoulders that had to be 4 feet across. The whole body was covered in dark brown hair that looked thick and matted, hanging in clumps like it hadn't been groomed in years. It was standing perfectly upright on 2 legs, with its arms hanging down by its sides in a relaxed, almost casual posture. But here's the thing that really got to me. It was looking directly at me. Not startled, not surprised, not getting ready to run away like most wild animals would when they encounter a human. This creature was just standing there calmly, watching me approach on my ATV, like it had been waiting for me to show up. I stopped the ATV maybe 50 yards away from it, not sure what to do next. Part of me was thinking I should turn around and get out of there as fast as possible. But another part of me was fascinated by what I was seeing, curious about what this thing was and what it might do next. We stared at each other for what felt like a long time, but was probably only 30 or 40 seconds. The creature didn't move, didn't make any threatening gestures, just stood there watching me with what seemed like patient interest. I could see its chest rising and falling with its breathing, could see the way the hair moved slightly in the breeze, could even make out some details of its face from that distance. The face was definitely more human-like than animal-like, with dark skin visible beneath the hair around its eyes and mouth. The features were heavy and pronounced, but arranged in a way that suggested intelligence rather than simple animal instinct. Then, without any warning or dramatic gesture, it simply turned and walked away. Not ran, not crashed through the underbrush like a startled deer, just turned around and walked calmly into the forest with these long, measured steps. I watched it disappear between the trees, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost casual, like our encounter had been perfectly normal and it was just going about its business. I sat there on my ATV for several more minutes, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. My heart was pounding, but not really from fear, more from the adrenaline rush of seeing something extraordinary, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I thought I knew about wildlife in Tennessee. After a while, I worked up the courage to drive over to the clearing where the creature had been standing. I wanted to see if there were any tracks, any physical evidence that what I'd seen was real and not some kind of hallucination brought on by too much sun or not enough coffee. The ground in the clearing was fairly hard-packed dirt with some scattered leaves, not ideal for showing clear footprints. But I could see where something large and heavy had been standing. Compressed earth, disturbed leaves, a few broken twigs that looked like they'd been stepped on recently. More importantly, I could smell something unusual in the air. A musky, wild odor that was unlike anything I'd encountered before. Not unpleasant exactly, but definitely not natural to that environment. It reminded me a little of the smell you get around a barn where large animals are kept, but with an undertone that I couldn't identify. I didn't stay in that clearing long. Something about the place made me uncomfortable, like I was trespassing in an area where I didn't belong. I got back on my ATV and headed home, but I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that massive figure watching me from between the trees. That encounter stayed with me for years. I'd think about it whenever I was out in the woods, wondering if I might see the creature again, wondering what it was and where it had come from. But as time passed, the memory started to fade a little, and I began to question whether I'd really seen what I thought I'd seen. Then, in early 2023, it happened again. This time it was completely different. I was at home on a warm January night, sitting on my back porch with a friend from church. We'd been talking about some repairs I needed to make to my roof, just casual conversation, when we heard something moving at the edge of the forest behind my house. At first it sounded like a deer or maybe a wild pig pushing through the underbrush, but the sounds were too heavy, too deliberate for most wild animals. Each step created this deep crunching sound, as whatever was moving stepped on fallen leaves and broken branches. My friend heard it too. He stopped talking mid-sentence, and we both turned toward the tree line, trying to figure out what was making the noise. The sounds were getting louder, and it was clear that whatever was out there was big and was moving in our direction. That's when we heard it start running. The footsteps suddenly accelerated, and we could hear branches breaking and underbrush being crushed as something large came crashing through the forest toward us. The sound was getting closer fast, and within seconds it was obvious that whatever was out there was heading straight for my backyard. We both jumped up and ran for the house without even discussing it. The rational part of my brain was telling me it was probably just a spooked deer or a wild hog that had been startled by our voices, but my instincts were screaming at me to get inside and lock the door. We made it to the back door and slammed it shut just as the sounds reached the edge of my yard. Looking out through the window, we couldn't see anything in the darkness, but we could hear something large moving around just beyond the reach of my porch light. Heavy breathing, the sound of footsteps on gravel, and this low rumbling noise that was almost like a growl, but deeper and more controlled. Whatever was out there spent maybe 5 minutes moving around my backyard before the sounds finally faded back into the forest. We stayed inside for another hour, jumping at every little noise, before we finally worked up the courage to look outside again. By then, everything was quiet and normal, but neither of us felt like sitting on the porch anymore that night. The next morning, I found tracks in the soft earth around my house. Big tracks, much larger than any human foot, with clearly defined toes and deep impressions that suggested something incredibly heavy. The tracks formed a rough circle around my entire house, like whatever had made them had been patrolling the perimeter of my property. I've had 2 more encounters since then, both while I was out walking in the forest during daylight hours. In one case, I heard something large moving parallel to me through the trees, staying just out of sight, but clearly keeping pace with my movements. In the other, I found a series of trees that had been broken in ways that didn't look natural, snapped off at about 8 feet high, twisted and bent like something with incredible strength had been marking its territory. I've also found more tracks, always in soft ground, near water sources or in muddy areas after heavy rains. The tracks are consistent, always the same size and shape, always showing the same pattern of toes and heel impressions. But here's the thing that really gets to me: the intelligence these encounters suggest. That first sighting back in 2009, the way the creature had just stood there calmly watching me, showed a level of self-control and decision-making that you don't see in most wild animals. It had evaluated me as a potential threat, decided I wasn't dangerous, and then simply walked away without any drama or panic. The incident at my house was different, more territorial, more aggressive, but still controlled. Whatever had been out there hadn't tried to break in or cause damage. It had investigated my property, made its presence known, and then left, like it was sending me a message rather than trying to harm me. And the parallel tracking, the way something had followed my movements through the forest while staying hidden, suggested planning and strategy that goes way beyond simple animal behavior. I've done a lot of research since these encounters started, reading about similar experiences in Tennessee and surrounding states. I've been surprised to find out how many people have reported seeing large, upright creatures in remote forest areas, often exhibiting the same kind of intelligent behavior I've witnessed. But most people don't talk about it openly, and I understand why. It sounds crazy when you try to explain it to someone who hasn't experienced it themselves. How do you convince people that there are unknown creatures living in our forests, creatures that are smart enough to avoid human contact most of the time, but occasionally reveal themselves for reasons we can't understand? I still live on the same property, still walk in the same forests, but I'm a lot more aware of my surroundings now. I pay attention to sounds that don't quite fit the normal patterns of wildlife. I look for signs that something large has been moving through areas where I plan to spend time. And I always make sure I can get back to my house quickly if I need to. Sometimes I catch myself hoping I'll have another encounter, another chance to observe these creatures and maybe learn something more about their behavior and intelligence. But other times, especially when I'm alone in the woods after dark, I find myself hoping they'll just leave me alone and go about their business without involving me in it. The thing that bothers me most is not knowing what they want or why they've chosen to reveal themselves to me. Are they curious about human behavior? Are they protecting territory that they consider theirs? Are they trying to communicate something that I'm too dense to understand? Or are they just going about their lives in the same forests where I happen to live, and our paths cross occasionally through pure chance? I may never know the answers to those questions, but I do know one thing for certain. I'm not alone on this property. There's something else living in these hills and valleys, something intelligent and powerful and completely unknown to mainstream science. And it's still out there, somewhere in the darkness between the trees, watching and waiting and deciding when to show itself again. Story 12. This happened on a clear September afternoon in 2011, and I still get chills every time I drive down Highway 127 near Pikeville, Tennessee. I was picking up my daughter from volleyball practice at the high school. She'd gotten sick during training and called me to come get her early. Nothing unusual about that. Kids get sick all the time. But what happened on the drive home changed everything I thought I knew about what lives in the mountains around our area. My daughter was 15 then, a sophomore on the JV volleyball team. She'd been complaining about a headache and nausea during practice, so her coach had called me around 3:30 to come pick her up. The school was maybe 20 minutes from our house, a drive I'd made hundreds of times over the years for sports practices, school events, and everything else that comes with raising a teenager. It was one of those perfect early fall days in East Tennessee, sunny but not hot, with just enough breeze to make the leaves rustle. The kind of weather that makes you want to roll the windows down and take the long way home. We'd been driving for maybe 10 minutes, heading east on Highway 127, when I saw something that made me hit the brakes so hard, my daughter asked if I was okay. There was something standing on the side of the road. At first glance, you might think it was a person, maybe someone whose car had broken down or who was waiting for a ride. But as we got closer, I realized this wasn't any person I'd ever seen before. The thing was huge, easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller, with shoulders that had to be at least 4 feet across. The entire body was covered in dark hair that looked almost black in the afternoon sunlight. But here's what really got my attention. It was just standing there, completely still, looking across the road at a pasture full of cattle. The creature wasn't moving, wasn't pacing back and forth like an animal might, wasn't showing any signs of agitation or fear. It was just standing at the edge of the pavement, maybe 30 feet from the tree line, staring at those cows like it was studying them or trying to figure something out. I stopped the car completely. maybe 40 yards away from the thing, just sat there staring at it with my mouth hanging open. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My daughter was slumped against the passenger window, still feeling sick, and didn't notice anything unusual at first. The creature must have heard our car stop because it slowly turned its head to look at us. When it did, I got the shock of my life. This thing was looking directly at me, making eye contact through the windshield, and I could see intelligence in those eyes. Not the dumb stare of an animal, but something that suggested awareness, maybe even curiosity about why we'd stopped. We looked at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 or 30 seconds. I was completely frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This creature was massive, easily the biggest living thing I'd ever seen standing upright. But it didn't seem aggressive or threatening. It just stood there calmly, studying me the same way I was studying it. I need to give you some perspective on the size of this thing. My brother is 6'6", and my dad is 6'8", both big men who stand out in any crowd. But this creature was easily a foot taller than my dad, maybe more. And where my dad and brother are tall and lean, this thing was built like a linebacker, with muscles that bulged even under all that hair. The shoulders were the most impressive part. They had to be 3.5 feet wide, maybe closer to 4, giving the creature this incredible bulk that made it look like it could move a car if it wanted to. The arms hung down almost to its knees, much longer than human arms, and they looked thick and powerful even from that distance. The hair covering its body was dense and dark, almost black, but with some lighter patches that showed brown or gray in the sunlight. The hair on its head was longer, hanging down over its shoulders like an unkempt mane, but around the face the hair was shorter, and I could see dark skin underneath, with features that were surprisingly human-like for something so massive. After that long stare down, the creature did something that I'll never forget. It took 2 steps, just 2 long, smooth strides, and disappeared into the forest. One moment it was standing there in broad daylight, clear as day, and the next it was gone. It moved so quickly and quietly that if I hadn't been watching it the whole time, I might have thought it vanished into thin air. I sat in my car for several more minutes, engine running, just staring at the spot where the thing had been standing. My hands were shaking, and I felt like I might throw up from the adrenaline rush. This was broad daylight, clear weather, perfect visibility. There was no way I could have misidentified what I'd seen. Finally, my daughter asked what was wrong, why we weren't moving. I looked at her and realized she hadn't seen anything. She'd been feeling sick, resting against the window, and had missed the entire encounter. I didn't know what to tell her. How do you explain to your 15-year-old daughter that you just saw Bigfoot standing beside Highway 127? I decided not to say anything right then. She was already feeling bad, and I didn't want to upset her further with something that would sound completely insane. Instead, I just told her I thought I'd seen a bear and wanted to make sure it wasn't going to wander into the road, but I had to go back and look for evidence. That evening, after my daughter was feeling better and my wife was home to keep an eye on her, I drove back to the spot where I'd seen the creature. I brought my husband with me, figuring I'd need a witness if I found anything unusual, and also because I wasn't sure I wanted to be out there alone after what I'd experienced. We found the exact spot easily enough. There was a distinctive bend in the guardrail and a particular arrangement of trees that I remembered clearly. In daylight, it looked like any other stretch of rural highway, nothing special or unusual about it. But when we got out of the car and walked to the edge of the road where the creature had been standing, we found something that made my skin crawl. The grass was flattened in a pattern that looked exactly like something large had been standing there for an extended period. Not trampled randomly like cattle might do, but compressed in a specific shape that corresponded to where I'd seen the creature's feet. The impressions were huge, much larger than any human footprint, and they were deep enough to suggest something incredibly heavy had been standing there. We also found broken branches on some of the smaller trees at the edge of the forest, snapped off at a height that would be consistent with something 8 or 9 feet tall, pushing through the underbrush. The breaks looked fresh, probably made within the last few hours. But the most convincing evidence was in the pasture across the road. The cattle were all bunched up in the far corner of the field, as far away from the road as they could get. Now, cows are curious animals by nature. They usually come to investigate when people stop near their pasture, hoping for treats or just wanting to see what's going on. But these cows were acting like they'd been spooked by something, huddled together and clearly reluctant to come anywhere near the area where I'd seen the creature. My husband was skeptical at first, but when he saw the flattened grass and the broken branches, he started taking the whole thing more seriously. We spent maybe an hour searching the area, looking for footprints or hair samples or anything else that might provide physical evidence of what I'd encountered. We didn't find any clear footprints. The ground was too hard and covered with too much vegetation, but we did find several more broken branches leading into the forest, creating a clear path that something large had taken when it disappeared into the trees. The strangest thing was a series of parallel scratches on the bark of a large oak tree, positioned about 7 feet off the ground. The scratches looked fresh, and they were arranged in groups of 4, like they might have been made by claws or very strong fingernails. Whatever had made those marks was tall enough to reach that high while standing on the ground, and strong enough to gouge deep lines in the bark. We took pictures of everything we found, but like most evidence of unusual encounters, the photos didn't really capture the full impact of what we were seeing. The flattened grass just looked like grass. The broken branches could have been caused by wind or animals, and the scratches on the tree could have been explained away by any number of natural causes, but I knew what I'd seen, and the evidence we found that evening convinced me that it had been real. Over the next few weeks, I did a lot of research on Bigfoot sightings in Tennessee and the surrounding states. I was surprised to discover that there had been quite a few reports of large, upright creatures in the general area around Pikeville, some going back for decades. Most of the descriptions matched what I'd observed. Creatures 8 to 10 feet tall, covered in dark hair with broad shoulders and long arms. Several witnesses mentioned the same calm, intelligent behavior I'd seen, the way these things seemed to study humans rather than flee from them in panic. I also learned that cattle often react strongly to the presence of unknown predators, gathering together in defensive groups and refusing to graze in areas where they've detected threatening scents. The behavior of those cows across the road from where I'd seen the creature was completely consistent with animals that had detected a large predator in the area. A few months later, I had another piece of evidence that convinced me my encounter had been real. I was driving past the same area on a different day when I noticed that several large sections of grass in the pasture across the road had been flattened in a distinctive pattern. The flattened areas formed a rough path leading from the tree line where I'd seen the creature straight across the pasture toward where the cattle usually grazed. It looked like something large and heavy had walked directly through that field, leaving a clear trail in the grass. The path was too wide and too consistently compressed to have been made by any normal farm animal, and it led directly from the forest to the area where the cows spent most of their time. The thought that this creature might have been coming into that pasture regularly, maybe hunting or just observing the cattle, was both fascinating and disturbing. How long had it been doing this? How many times had it crossed that field without any humans noticing? And most importantly, what had made it decide to stand beside the highway that day in broad daylight, where anyone driving by could see it? I've driven past that spot hundreds of times since then, always slowing down, always looking for any sign of movement in the trees. I've never seen the creature again, but sometimes I notice that the cattle are bunched up in the far corner of the pasture, acting nervous and skittish like they did that day. My daughter is grown up now, with kids of her own, but she still doesn't know what really happened that afternoon when I picked her up from volleyball practice. Sometimes I think about telling her, but I'm not sure she'd believe me. It sounds crazy even to me, and I'm the one who lived through it. But I know what I saw that September day on Highway 127. I know that creature was real, and I know it was studying those cattle with an intelligence that suggested it was much more than just an unknown animal species. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, still moving through those forests around Pikeville, still observing human activity and trying to understand our world. And sometimes, when I'm driving through that area after dark, I find myself looking into the trees and wondering what might be looking back. The thing that bothers me most about the whole experience is how calm and deliberate the creature seemed. This wasn't some panicked animal that had been surprised by human presence. It had been standing there for a reason, doing something specific, and when it noticed me watching, it had simply decided to leave. That suggests a level of intelligence and decision-making that I find deeply unsettling. If these creatures are smart enough to evaluate situations and make conscious choices about how to respond to humans, then they're operating on a level that goes far beyond simple animal behavior. And if they're that intelligent, then there's probably a lot more going on in our forests than any of us realize. Story 13. This happened in the summer of 2005 in the Eagle Cap Wilderness, up in the Wallowa Mountains of northeast Oregon, and it's the reason I don't go camping above the tree line anymore. I was part of a military training exercise, about 12 of us total, doing some field maneuvers in some of the most remote country you can imagine. We're talking about Alpine terrain, where you can hike for days without seeing another soul, where the nearest road is 20 miles away, and the nearest town might as well be on another planet. The Eagle Cap Wilderness is serious backcountry. Jagged peaks that shoot straight up into the sky, glacial valleys carved out by ice thousands of years ago, and terrain so rough that even experienced mountaineers think twice before heading up there. But that's exactly why the military uses it for training. If you can navigate and survive in the Eagle Cap, you can handle just about anything the world throws at you. We'd been up there for 4 days already, working on high-altitude operations and wilderness survival techniques. Our base camp was set up above the tree line at around 8,000 feet elevation, on this rocky plateau that gave us a clear view of the valleys below and the peaks rising up all around us. Beautiful country, but harsh. The kind of place where the weather can change from perfect sunshine to a whiteout blizzard in the space of an hour. On this particular afternoon, I was on lookout duty, while the rest of the team worked on some radio communication exercises. I was positioned on a rocky outcrop, maybe 100 yards from camp, with a good view of the approaches from 3 different directions. Standard military procedure. You always have someone watching when you're in unfamiliar territory. It was one of those perfect mountain days, probably around 70 degrees, with a light breeze and not a cloud in the sky. The kind of weather that makes you understand why people fall in love with the mountains, even though they'll kill you without hesitation if you make a mistake. I was scanning the terrain below our position with binoculars, just doing routine surveillance, when I spotted movement in a valley maybe half a mile away. At first, I thought it might be a bear. We'd seen several black bears during our time up there, and they're not uncommon in that area. But as I focused the binoculars and got a clearer look, I realized this wasn't any bear I'd ever seen. The thing was moving across a large patch of snow in the bottom of the valley, and from that distance, it looked like a dark spot against the white background. But the way it was moving was all wrong for a bear. Bears lumber along on 4 legs, with this distinctive rolling gait that you can recognize from a long way off. This thing was walking upright on 2 legs, with a smooth, steady stride that covered ground fast. I watched it for maybe 2 minutes as it crossed that snowfield. The distance was too great to make out any details, but I could see enough to know that whatever I was looking at was big, dark-colored, and definitely walking on two legs like a human would. Except no human could move across that kind of terrain at that pace. The snow had to be at least knee-deep, and the creature was walking through it like it was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. When it reached the other side of the snowfield, it started climbing up a steep, rocky slope that would have been challenging for an experienced climber mountaineer with proper equipment. But this thing just walked straight up the incline without slowing down, moving with this fluid grace that suggested it was perfectly at home in that kind of terrain. I called over to the rest of my team, told them to come take a look at what I'd spotted. By the time they got to my position with their own binoculars, the creature had moved up onto a ridge where it was silhouetted against the sky. Even from that distance, we could all see that it was much taller and broader than a human, with proportions that didn't match any known animal. We took turns watching it through the binoculars as it moved along the ridge line. The thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe 8, with shoulders that were incredibly wide and arms that seemed longer than they should be. Its whole body was covered in what looked like dark fur or hair, and it moved with this confident stride that suggested it knew exactly where it was going. But here's the thing that really got to us. It was moving through terrain that would challenge a team of experienced climbers, and it was doing it without any apparent effort. The ridge it was following was narrow and rocky, with steep drop-offs on both sides. Most humans would be moving carefully, testing each step, probably using ropes for safety. This creature was just walking along like it was strolling down a sidewalk. After maybe 10 minutes of observation, the thing disappeared behind a rocky outcrop and we lost sight of it completely. We kept watching for another hour, hoping it might reappear, but we never saw it again. That evening, we had a team meeting to discuss what we'd observed. These were all experienced soldiers, guys who'd been in combat, seen action in some pretty intense situations. Not the kind of people who spook easily or let their imaginations run wild. But every one of us agreed that we'd seen something that didn't fit with any known wildlife in the Oregon mountains. The team leader suggested it might have been a person, maybe a solo hiker or climber who was moving through the area. But that didn't make sense for several reasons. First, the size was all wrong. This thing was much bigger than any human. Second, the terrain it was crossing would be extremely dangerous for a solo hiker without specialized equipment. And third, it was moving through an area where civilians aren't supposed to be. The military had restricted access to that entire region for our training exercise. Someone else suggested it might have been a bear that occasionally walked upright, maybe because of an injury or some other physical issue. Bears can rear up on their hind legs for short periods, but they don't walk long distances that way. And the creature we'd observed had been walking upright for the entire time we watched it, covering maybe a mile of difficult terrain without ever dropping to all fours. The more we talked about it, the more convinced we became that we'd encountered something extraordinary. But we also agreed that there wasn't much we could do about it. Our mission was to complete the training exercise, not investigate unknown wildlife. And even if we wanted to investigate, the creature had disappeared into terrain that would take hours to reach on foot. That night, none of us got much sleep. Maybe it was the altitude, or the stress of the training, or just the adrenaline from seeing something so unexpected. But I think we were all a little spooked by what we'd witnessed. The thought that there might be large, unknown animals living in some of the most remote mountains in North America was both fascinating and unsettling. The next morning, we broke camp and moved to a different area for the next phase of our training. But as we packed up our gear and prepared to leave, I found myself looking back toward the valley where I'd first spotted the creature. Part of me was hoping to see it again, to get another look and maybe learn something more about what it was. But another part of me was relieved to be moving on, putting some distance between us and whatever was living in those mountains. During the hike to our new location, we had to cross the same valley where I'd first seen the creature moving across the snowfield. When we reached the snow, I took the opportunity to look for tracks or other evidence that might confirm what we'd observed the day before. The snow was deeper than I'd expected, probably closer to waist deep in most places. It would have been exhausting for a human to walk through snow that deep, but the creature had moved across it without any apparent difficulty. That suggested either incredible physical strength or adaptations that allowed it to move efficiently through deep snow. I did find what might have been tracks, but the snow conditions made it impossible to be certain. There were some depressions that could have been footprints, much larger than human feet would make, but they were partially filled with wind-blown snow and too indistinct to provide clear evidence. We finished our training exercise 2 days later and returned to base. During the debrief, our team leader mentioned the sighting in his official report, but he described it as possible wildlife observation of unknown species rather than anything more dramatic. Military reports tend to be pretty conservative, and nobody wanted to sound like they'd been hallucinating in the mountains. But among ourselves, we kept talking about what we'd seen. Over the years, some of the guys from that team have told me about other unusual experiences they've had in remote wilderness areas. Sounds that didn't match any known animals, tracks that were too big to be made by humans, sightings of large creatures moving through forests or across mountain slopes. It's like once you've seen something like that, you start paying attention to things you might have ignored before. You realize that there's a lot about the natural world that we don't understand, especially in places where humans rarely go. I've been back to the Eagle Cap Wilderness several times since that training exercise, mostly for personal hiking and climbing trips. It's still some of the most beautiful country I've ever seen, but I look at it differently now. Those vast expanses of wilderness aren't just empty landscapes. They're places where unknown things might be living, adapting, surviving in ways that we can't imagine. I've never had another sighting like that day in 2005, but I've found evidence that suggests large animals move through that area regularly, broken branches at heights that would require something very tall to reach, depressions in soft ground that look like they might be footprints, and sometimes a musky smell in the air that doesn't match any of the wildlife I'm familiar with. The thing that really gets to me is how perfectly adapted that creature seemed to be for life in extreme mountain terrain. The way it moved across deep snow, the ease with which it climbed steep rocky slopes, the confidence it showed in navigating dangerous terrain. All of that suggested an animal that had evolved specifically for life in the high mountains. If there are unknown species living in places like the Eagle Cap Wilderness, it would make sense that they'd be adapted to environments where humans rarely venture. The high alpine zones of major mountain ranges are some of the most isolated places on Earth, where an intelligent species could live for thousands of years without regular contact with human civilization. But it also raises disturbing questions about how much we really know about the natural world. If something that large can live undetected in North American wilderness areas, what else might be out there? How many other species are we sharing this continent with without realizing it? Sometimes I think about that creature moving along that narrow ridge, perfectly at ease in terrain that would kill most humans. I wonder where it was going, what it was doing up there in that harsh alpine environment. Was it hunting, traveling between different territories, following migration routes that its species had used for thousands of years? And I wonder if it saw us too, if it was aware of our camp and our activities. Maybe it was watching us the same way we were watching it, curious about these strange visitors to its mountain home. That thought is both humbling and unsettling. The idea that we might be the ones being observed, being studied by intelligences that we don't even know exist, changes your perspective on wilderness areas completely. When I'm in the mountains now, especially in remote areas above the tree line, I find myself looking more carefully at the landscape around me. Not just for hazards or navigation landmarks, but for signs of life that might not appear in any field guide or natural history text. Because I know now that there are things living in our wildest places that science hasn't catalogued yet. Creatures that have learned to survive in environments so harsh that humans can barely visit them, let alone live there permanently. And sometimes, if you're in the right place at the right time and you're paying attention, you might catch a glimpse of them moving across a distant snowfield, heading toward destinations that we can't even imagine. Story 14. This happened in the summer of 2016, and it's the reason my friends and I don't go camping in West Virginia anymore. We'd been planning this trip for months, 4 of us, all in our late 20s, looking to get away from our desk jobs and spend a weekend in some real wilderness. The Allegheny Mountains seemed perfect. Deep forests, no cell service, the kind of place where you can actually hear yourself think. We drove about 3 hours from the city, following increasingly smaller roads until we were on this dirt track that our GPS couldn't even find. The last ranger station we'd passed was maybe 20 miles back, and we'd been driving on Forest Service roads for another hour after that. This was exactly the kind of isolation we were looking for. No other campers, no RVS, just us and the mountains. The campsite we found was perfect. A small clearing next to a slow-moving creek, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. The trees were massive, old-growth hardwoods that had probably been there for centuries. You could barely see the sky through the canopy, and the understory was so thick you couldn't see more than 30 feet in any direction. We set up our tents in the late afternoon, got a fire going, and spent the evening doing what guys do when they're camping. Drinking beer, telling stories, and pretending we were tougher than we actually were. It felt good to be away from the city, away from work stress, just relaxing in the middle of nowhere. That first night was when we heard the knocking. It started around midnight, just as we were getting ready to turn in for the night. A single loud bang, like someone had taken a baseball bat and whacked it against a tree trunk. The sound echoed through the forest, and then everything went quiet again. We all looked at each other around the dying fire, wondering what had made the noise. Could have been a dead branch falling, or maybe a woodpecker, though it seemed late at night for that. After a few minutes of nothing, we decided it was probably just normal forest sounds and went to bed. But 20 minutes later, it happened again. Another loud bang, this time from a different direction, maybe 100 yards away from our camp. Then another one from somewhere else entirely. The sounds were spaced out, maybe 5 or 10 minutes apart, and they seemed to be coming from all around us. None of us got much sleep that first night. Every time one of those banging sounds echoed through the forest, we'd all wake up and lie there in our tents, listening and wondering what was making the noise. By morning, we were all pretty tired and on edge, but daylight made everything seem normal again. The forest looked peaceful and welcoming. The creek was babbling quietly, and those mysterious sounds from the night before seemed like they might have been our imagination. We made breakfast, did some hiking, and convinced ourselves that we'd just been spooked by unfamiliar sounds. The second night was worse. The banging started earlier this time, maybe around 10 o'clock, while we were still sitting around the fire. The first sound was so loud and so close that we all jumped. It came from maybe 50 yards away, in the forest behind where we'd set up our tents. Then we heard something that made our blood run cold. Movement in the woods. Not the random rustling of small animals, but deliberate footsteps. Something large was walking through the forest, stepping on fallen branches and dry leaves. The footsteps were slow and heavy, like whatever was making them was in no hurry but weighed a lot. We grabbed flashlights and tried to see what was out there, but the forest was too thick and too dark. The beams of our lights just disappeared into the undergrowth after 20 or 30 feet. But we could hear the footsteps getting closer, moving in a rough circle around our campsite. That's when the second bang came, much closer than before. It sounded like it was maybe 20 yards away, just beyond the reach of our firelight. The sound was so loud, it seemed to vibrate through the ground, and I swear I felt it in my chest. We all stood up at the same time, grabbed whatever we could use as weapons, camp hatchet, kitchen knives, a tire iron from one of the trucks, and formed a defensive circle around the fire. The footsteps had stopped after that second bang, but we could feel something watching us from the darkness. For maybe 10 minutes, everything was quiet, except for the crackling of our fire and our own nervous breathing. Then we heard the most terrifying sound I've ever experienced in my life. A scream, but not human. Something deeper, more primal, like it was coming from an animal the size of a truck. The sound went on for maybe 10 seconds, rising and falling in pitch, echoing through the mountains like nothing I'd ever heard before. That's when we decided we were leaving. We didn't discuss it, didn't debate whether we were being cowards or overreacting. We just started breaking camp as fast as we could, throwing our gear into the trucks without bothering to pack it properly. The whole time, we kept hearing those footsteps moving around the edge of our campsite, and occasionally another one of those banging sounds would echo through the forest. We were loading the last of our stuff when the first rock hit. It came flying out of the darkness and landed right in the middle of our fire, sending sparks and burning logs scattering everywhere. The rock was about the size of a softball, and it had been thrown hard enough to completely destroy our fire pit. Before we could react, another rock hit the side of one of our trucks with a loud metallic bang. Then another one landed right between us, missing my buddy's head by maybe 3 feet. We ran for the trucks and got the hell out of there. The drive out was a nightmare. Our headlights only cut through maybe 50 feet of darkness, and the dirt road was full of ruts and potholes that we couldn't see until we hit them. But we didn't dare slow down. Every few minutes, one of us would think we saw movement in the trees beside the road, shadows that seemed too big and too deliberately moving to be natural. When we finally reached the paved road, we didn't stop driving until we found an all-night gas station about 50 miles away. We sat in the parking lot under the fluorescent lights, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what had just happened to us. None of us had seen whatever was throwing those rocks or making those sounds, but we'd all heard it moving around in the forest. Something large, something that could throw rocks with incredible accuracy, something that seemed to be deliberately harassing us until we left its territory. We went back the next summer, but not alone. This time, we brought 8 people and enough camping gear to set up a proper base camp. We also brought cameras, audio recording equipment, and a couple of guys who'd been in the military and knew how to handle themselves in difficult situations. The second trip was when things really got crazy. We set up camp in a different location, maybe 5 miles from where we'd been the year before. But it was the same kind of terrain. Thick forest, isolated clearing, the feeling that we were completely alone in the wilderness. The first night was quiet, which actually made us more nervous. We'd been expecting something to happen based on our previous experience, and the complete silence felt ominous. But around 1 in the morning, the activity started. It began with that same loud banging sound we remembered from the year before. But this time, we were ready for it. We had our cameras set up with night vision capability and audio equipment positioned around the perimeter of our camp. The banging continued for about an hour, always from just outside the range of our lights, always loud enough to make us jump, even though we were expecting it. Then we started hearing the footsteps again, that same heavy, deliberate movement through the forest. But this time, we could hear more of them. Not just one set of footsteps, but several, moving around our campsite in what seemed like a coordinated pattern. Whatever was out there, there was more than one of them, and they were working together. That's when we saw it. One of our cameras was positioned to cover the area behind our tents, looking into the forest where we'd been hearing most of the movement. Around 2 in the morning, it captured something that made us all forget about trying to be brave. A massive figure stepped into view at the very edge of the camera's range. It was only visible for maybe 3 seconds before it moved back into the darkness, but those 3 seconds were enough to change everything. The creature was enormous. easily 8 feet tall, maybe taller, with shoulders that had to be 4 feet across. Its whole body was covered in thick, dark hair that seemed to absorb the infrared light from our camera. But the most terrifying thing was how it moved. There was nothing clumsy or awkward about its movement. It stepped into view, turned to look directly at our camera like it knew exactly what it was, and then stepped back into the darkness with this fluid, controlled motion that suggested intelligence and purpose. After that brief appearance, things escalated quickly. The banging sounds got louder and more frequent, coming from all around us now instead of just 1 or 2 directions. The footsteps multiplied, and we could hear what sounded like several large creatures moving through the forest around our camp. Then the rock throwing started. The first few rocks were small, maybe the size of golf balls, and they landed just outside our circle of tents. But they got bigger and more accurate as the night went on. Soon we had rocks the size of baseballs landing right in the middle of our camp. And then one hit the side of our truck so hard it left a dent. We tried to get a look at whatever was throwing the rocks, but every time we pointed our lights toward where they seemed to be coming from, everything would go quiet for a few minutes. It was like they knew exactly how to stay just outside our range of vision while still being able to target us with incredible accuracy. Around 3 in the morning, we heard the scream again. But this time it wasn't just one voice, it was several, calling back and forth to each other across the forest. The sounds were coordinated, like they were communicating, planning something together. That's when we saw the second creature. This one appeared at the other end of our campsite, maybe 40 feet away from where the first one had been spotted. It was just as large, just as imposing, and it stood at the edge of our firelight for maybe 10 seconds, looking directly at us. But unlike the first creature, this one didn't retreat immediately. It took several steps forward, moving with those same long, controlled strides, coming close enough that we could see details even in the dim firelight. The face was incredible, definitely more human than animal, but with features that were heavy and primitive. Dark skin, deep-set eyes that reflected our firelight, and an expression that seemed both curious and threatening at the same time. Then it did something that I still can't explain. It reached down, picked up a rock about the size of a bowling ball, and threw it directly at our fire. Not a wild throw, not an accidental toss, a deliberate, accurate throw that scattered our burning logs and plunged our campsite into near-total darkness. In the chaos that followed, we could hear multiple creatures moving closer to our camp. Heavy footsteps on all sides, the sound of branches breaking, and those terrifying calls echoing back and forth between them. We grabbed our most essential gear and ran for the trucks. Again. But this time, they followed us. As we drove out on that narrow dirt road, we could see shapes moving through the trees on both sides, keeping pace with our vehicles. Every few hundred yards, a rock would come flying out of the forest and hit one of our trucks. Not random throws, but targeted hits that seemed designed to let us know we were being escorted out of their territory. The harassment continued for maybe 3 miles, until we reached a wider Forest Service road. Then, suddenly, everything stopped. The shapes disappeared from the trees, the rocks stopped flying, and we were alone again. We never went back to that area of West Virginia, and we never talked about our experiences with anyone who wasn't there. But we all kept copies of that footage from our night vision cameras, and sometimes we'll watch it again and try to make sense of what we encountered. The creature in that video is clearly not human, but it's also not like any animal we've ever seen. The size, the build, the way it moved, everything about it suggested something that shouldn't exist according to conventional zoology. But most disturbing was the intelligence it displayed. The coordinated harassment, the accurate rock throwing, the way they seemed to communicate with each other. All of that suggested creatures that were not only physically powerful, but also capable of complex planning and strategy. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed longer, if we tried to make contact or communicate with them in some way. But honestly, I'm glad we didn't find out. There was something about their behavior that suggested they were testing us, evaluating whether we were a threat to their territory. And I have the feeling that if they decided we were a problem, those rocks they were throwing would have been aimed a lot more directly at us instead of just around us. Whatever we encountered in those Allegheny Mountains, they're still out there, still watching the deep forests, still protecting their territory from human intrusion. And if you're ever camping in remote areas of West Virginia and you hear loud, banging sounds echoing through the forest at night, my advice is simple. Pack up your gear and leave. Don't wait to see what's making the noise. Don't try to get pictures or video. Just get out of there as fast as you can, because some things are better left undisturbed in the darkness between the trees. Story 15. This happened in November of 2018 in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas, and I still can't drive through that area without getting goosebumps. I was checking my beaver traps along the Buffalo River, something I'd been doing for over 15 years without any problems. The Buffalo is one of the most beautiful rivers in Arkansas, winding through some of the most remote country you can imagine, with limestone bluffs and thick forests that stretch for miles without a single house or road. I'd been running a trap line along about a 5-mile stretch of the river for most of that trapping season. Beaver pelts were bringing good money that year, and I had maybe 20 traps set up in various spots along the riverbank where I'd seen sign of beaver activity. It was hard work. Checking traps means wading through cold water, dealing with heavy steel traps, and hauling dead animals back to your truck, but it was good supplemental income during the slow months. This particular day was late in the season, probably mid-November, and we'd just had our first real cold snap. The temperature had dropped into the 20s the night before, with a hard frost that left everything covered in ice crystals. But the afternoon had warmed up to maybe 45 degrees. Perfect weather for checking traps without freezing your hands off. I was working my way upstream, checking each trap location methodically. Some had been triggered but were empty. Probably coyotes or raccoons had stolen the bait. Others had caught small fish or turtles that I had to release. But I hadn't caught a beaver all week, which was frustrating because I knew they were active in the area. It was getting late in the day, probably around 5:30, when I reached the trap that was furthest upstream from where I'd parked my truck. The sun was already getting low behind the hills, and the shadows were starting to get long. I had maybe an hour of good daylight left, which was cutting it close for the hike back to my vehicle. The trap was set in a small backwater area where a creek joined the main river. Perfect beaver habitat, with plenty of trees they like to chew and calm water for building dams. I'd caught 2 good-sized beavers in that same spot earlier in the season, so I was optimistic about what I might find. But as I approached the trap, I started to notice something was wrong. First was the smell. Even from 50 yards away, I could detect this terrible odor carried on the breeze. It was like wet dog mixed with sewage, with an undertone of something rotting that made my stomach turn. I'd smelled a lot of unpleasant things during my years of trapping: dead animals, stagnant water, various kinds of animal waste. But this was different, stronger and more complex, with layers of scent that seemed almost intentionally offensive. The smell got worse as I got closer to the trap. By the time I was 20 yards away, it was so strong that I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. Whatever was causing that stench, it was concentrated right around where my trap was set. That's when I realized I could hear something moving in the vegetation along the riverbank. At first, I thought it might be a raccoon or a possum that had been attracted by the smell of whatever was in my trap. But the sounds were too heavy, too deliberate. Something large was moving through the thick underbrush, breaking branches and crunching through the fallen leaves. I stopped walking and listened carefully, trying to figure out what I was dealing with. The sounds were coming from the slope above the river, maybe 30 feet up from the water's edge. Whatever was making the noise was moving slowly, like it wasn't in any hurry, but was definitely heading in my direction. That's when I got my first look at the creature. I was standing in a small clearing near the water's edge, when something moved into view on the wooded slope above me. At first, all I could see was a dark shape between the trees, but as it got closer, I realized I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The thing was massive, easily 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8, with shoulders that had to be 4 feet across. Its entire body was covered in reddish-brown hair that looked thick and matted, hanging in long strands that swayed as it moved. But what really got my attention was how it was walking. This creature was moving upright on 2 legs, with a smooth, controlled gait that suggested it was perfectly comfortable in that terrain. It wasn't stumbling or struggling with the steep slope and thick vegetation like a person would. It was just walking through the forest like it owned the place, pushing aside branches and stepping over fallen logs without breaking stride. But the most terrifying thing was that it was looking directly at me. The creature had stopped maybe 30 feet away from where I was standing, and it was staring at me with this calm, measuring look that made my skin crawl. Its face was more human-like than animal-like, with dark skin visible beneath the hair and eyes that seemed too intelligent for any wild animal I'd ever encountered. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I was completely frozen, not sure if I should run, stand my ground, or try to back away slowly. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold onto my equipment. The creature tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me, trying to figure out what I was and whether I was a threat. There was something almost curious about its expression, but also something that suggested it could be dangerous if it wanted to be. Then, without any warning, it turned and started walking away. Not running, not crashing through the underbrush in panic, just turning around and walking calmly back up the slope. I watched it disappear between the trees with those same long, controlled strides it had used to approach me. But I could still hear it moving through the forest, and the sounds were getting closer again. After maybe 5 minutes, I realized the creature was circling around me, moving through the thick vegetation in a wide arc that would bring it back to the riverbank, somewhere downstream from where I was standing. I couldn't see it anymore, but I could track its movement by the sounds of breaking branches and disturbed leaves. That's when I noticed the smell was getting stronger. The terrible odor that had first alerted me to something unusual was now so intense that my eyes were starting to water. It seemed to be coming from all around me now, not just from one direction, like the creature was deliberately positioning itself upwind from me, using its scent to intimidate or disorient me. I decided I needed to get out of there immediately. I abandoned the trap I'd come to check and started walking quickly back downstream toward where I'd parked my truck. But every few hundred yards, I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the forest parallel to the river, and I knew the creature was following me. It wasn't being subtle about it either. I could hear it moving through the underbrush, keeping pace with my movements along the riverbank. Occasionally, I'd see a flash of reddish-brown hair between the trees, or catch sight of a massive shape moving through a gap in the vegetation. The most unsettling part was how intelligently it seemed to be tracking me. When I walked fast, it moved faster. When I slowed down to catch my breath, it slowed down too. When I stopped to listen, everything would go quiet for a minute or two. Then I'd hear it start moving again. It was like being hunted by something that understood my behavior and could anticipate my movements. About halfway back to my truck, I made a mistake that could have gotten me killed. I was walking along a narrow game trail that ran parallel to the river when I decided to take a shortcut through a thick stand of pine trees. The trail curved away from the water at that point, adding maybe half a mile to my hike. and I was getting nervous about losing daylight. So I left the trail and started pushing through the pines, figuring I could cut directly to another section of riverbank and save some time. But the vegetation was thicker than I'd expected, and within minutes I was struggling through dense undergrowth that grabbed at my clothes and equipment. That's when I realized I'd made a serious tactical error. The creature had been following me along the edge of the forest, staying maybe 50 yards away from the river where the trees provided good cover. But by leaving the riverbank and heading into the thick timber, I'd moved into its territory. Now it had the advantage of knowing the terrain better than I did. I could hear it moving much closer now, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. But the vegetation was so thick I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. Every few steps, I'd hear a branch snap or leaves rustle, and I knew it was pacing me through the forest. Then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The creature made a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a roar, but something deep and guttural that seemed to vibrate through the ground. It was a sound that conveyed power and aggression, like a warning that I was pushing my luck by being in its territory. I changed direction immediately, angling back toward the river as fast as I could move through the undergrowth. Branches were tearing at my jacket, thorns were catching my pants, and I kept tripping over fallen logs and hidden rocks. But I didn't care about noise or stealth anymore. I just wanted to get back to open ground where I could see what was around me. When I finally broke through the tree line and reached the riverbank again, I was maybe 200 yards from where I'd left the trail. I was breathing hard, sweating despite the cold air, and my hands were shaking from adrenaline and fear. But I was also alone. The forest behind me was quiet, and I couldn't hear any more sounds of movement in the trees. I stood there for several minutes, listening and watching the tree line, but there was no sign of the creature. Either it had lost interest in following me, or it was still back there in the thick timber, watching and waiting for me to make another mistake. I didn't wait to find out which. I covered the remaining distance to my truck in record time, walking as fast as I could without actually running. Every few hundred yards, I'd look back over my shoulder, expecting to see that massive shape following me along the riverbank, but I never saw anything. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and got out of there without looking back. The drive home was surreal. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd experienced. The size of the creature, the intelligence it had displayed, the way it had tracked my movements through the forest. None of it fit with any wildlife I was familiar with. But I also kept thinking about those eyes, the way it had looked at me with what seemed like curiosity rather than aggression. If it had wanted to hurt me, it certainly could have. There had been several moments when it was close enough to attack, especially when I was struggling through that thick timber. Instead, it had seemed more interested in observing me, maybe trying to understand what I was doing in its territory. The next day, I went back to the area with my brother, both of us armed and prepared for trouble. I wanted to check that trap I'd abandoned, and I also wanted to see if we could find any physical evidence of what I'd encountered. The trap was empty, but the area around it told a story that made me glad I'd gotten out of there when I did. The ground was torn up like something large and powerful had been moving around the trap for an extended period. Small trees were broken off at about shoulder height for something 8 feet tall, and there were gouges in the mud that looked like they might have been made by claws or very strong fingernails. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of footprints in a patch of soft mud near the water's edge. The prints were huge, at least 18 inches long and almost as wide, with 5 clearly defined toes and what looked like the impression of a heel. They were deep too, pressed into the mud by something that had to weigh at least 400 or 500 pounds. We made plaster casts of the clearest prints and took dozens of photographs from different angles. The detail was incredible. You could see the texture of skin on the sole, the individual toe impressions, even what looked like wrinkles and creases in the footpad. But even with all that evidence, I knew most people wouldn't believe what I'd experienced. The photographs could be faked, the casts could be manufactured, and the story itself sounded too much like something out of a monster movie to be taken seriously. So I kept quiet about it, except for telling my brother and a few close friends who I trusted not to think I'd lost my mind. I never went back to that stretch of the Buffalo River. There are plenty of other places to run a trap line, places where the only things you have to worry about are normal predators and bad weather. Whatever I encountered in those Ozark Mountains that November day, it's still out there somewhere, living in countries so remote that most people will never see it. But sometimes, when I'm working other areas along the river system, I catch a whiff of that same terrible smell carried on the wind. And sometimes I find broken trees and disturbed ground that suggests something large has been moving through the area. And I always wonder if it's the same creature I encountered that day, still roaming those hills and valleys, still watching from the shadows between the trees. The thing that bothers me most about the whole experience is how intelligent the creature seemed. The way it had tracked me, the way it had circled around to get upwind, the way it had seemed to understand my behavior and respond accordingly. All of that suggested something far more sophisticated than just an unknown animal species. If there are creatures like that living in our most remote wilderness areas, creatures with intelligence and strength that we can barely comprehend, then we know a lot less about the natural world than we think we do. And maybe that's for the best.